I think it's Saturday. Okay, we're live. Hopefully the sound works. It's Saturday, November 16th, and today we're gonna continue our discussion that we started last week, but we're gonna dedicate today to discussing it, which is pretty exciting. We'll discuss liberalism and the history of modernity. And I think Doc and Perba are going to lead that conversation. So I'll hand it over to the very esteemed Dr. Montero for all who don't know him.
And the only thing I would say in the face of that introduction, Emily, cut the dramatics.
Sometimes the world needs the dramatic.
Yeah, but good evening, everybody. We're going to try to look at this question of liberalism, what it is, what are its origins, and what is the nature of the crisis that it now faces. And pretty much is this the first crisis of American liberalism, but we'll try to go through that. First, a few words about the election, post-election, and Trump's cabinet picks, which is the cabinet picks are a way of understanding how he sees himself governing over the next 4 years. I am on this question of his cabinet. I'm like everybody else when I saw him trot out all these neocons and Zionists of the worst type. I'm saying the guy has turned on the people that elected him, and I associated it with his being a word that begins with a B, but which I won't use. But he had the Justice Department and the Department of National Intelligence, yes. And I'm saying, wow, what does this mean in the face of these other people? And so I had listened to podcasts by Alexander McClurius and Scott Ritter. Scott Ritter was on the Ronald Nixon podcast, and I kind of recommend that discussion. Scott Ritter and Alexander McClurius, like everybody else, were more than disappointed when he trots out Rubio and even this guy, Seth, or whatever his name is, and the National Security Advisor. And of course, the mainstream media played all of these clips of them making all these statements about Israel and Zionism and how, there is no West Bank, it's, whatever the Zionists call it, and so on. But then these other two come down. And so Scott Ritter says, and I don't agree with him on this, that the appointment of Tulsi Gabbard to head this interagency that unites all of the intelligence, security, deep state institutions, probably the center of a lot of what we would consider state power, at least a command center of state power. When I say a command center, they are decision makers and they carry out decisions in ways that neither the State Department nor the Defense Department or other departments can. Because at the end of the day, American foreign policy, which means policy to uphold and consolidate the power of American empire. That's precisely what it is. I mean, these agents And if you ever thought there was a democracy, just reference these organizations. But Scott Ritter said to appoint Tulsi Gabbard, the ultimate outsider, who herself was not a Republican until a few months ago, to head those agencies, which include the CIA, National Intel, I don't know the names of all of them, is literally an attack and a provocation against the deep state. I mean, it is something that has not been seen in 80 years or ever, because this whole configuration of intelligence and coup makers and people who have assassinated leaders all around the world, who decide what the mainstream media line is. It comes directly from the CIA and these other deep state institutions. Um, and he said this, I know he didn't say it this way, but I think what it meant, what he meant is that it was Trump literally saying that his government will be a move to seize state power. And that's why Ritter said it's a revolution. Now, it is just his saying that this is who he wants for the job. It is not, they don't have the job, she's not been confirmed. But it is, I mean, it is so far outside of what is imaginable, what we can imagine in the normal working out of politics and government in this country. What am I trying to say? For me, it's beyond imagination that Trump would appoint the head of all the intelligence agencies, a person that seems to be taking the position to destroy the CIA and the other aligned agencies. And if that is what this represents, then one could call it at least a step towards a revolutionary overturning of the most dangerous elements of the state. The most undemocratic, the most secretive, have meddled in elections and societies all over the world, have assassinated leaders, and so on and so forth. The other is Matt Gaetz to be the head of the Justice Department. Oh, by the way, and this is what Mercurius and Scott Ritter said, and I find them both to be quite informative and well informed, that it is, he didn't say this, but I'll say, one must consider it an attack upon the liberal state and its institutions, which will take us when we talk about liberalism. The other thing is Matt Gaetz, the head of the Justice Department. The Justice Department oversees the FBI, oversees federal investigations, and so on. Ritter said that Tulsi Gabbard will be the closest person to Trump on a day-to-day basis. That Marco Rubio in the State Department will be marginalized and in fact will report to the president. The same with the DOJ, DOD. But here is the point. It seems that Trump wishes to govern as they would say, a dictator, not just on the first day. In other words, the president's office, the presidency will be the center of a command system. There will not be the State Department doing its thing over here and whatever they do, and other departments doing whatever they do. On foreign policy, he will be the determiner of foreign policy. And we have to see what the implications of that are. But the person nearest to him on a day-to-day basis, reporting intelligence, reporting other things to him, will be Tulsi Gabbard. Who could have ever imagined this? A Samoan Hindu from Hawaii. You know what I'm saying? As far from the state and the deep state and the main centers of politics as you could get. And then, of course, Matt Gaetz, who was a congressman from Florida, never practiced law, although he has a law degree, going to be the head of a agency with this much power over investigation, over secretive spying on citizens, et cetera, just the whole. And is this Trump putting a wrecking ball to the deep state? Mercurius and Ritter feel it so. And I would just say, let us keep our eye on all of this. But the last time a president attacked the CIA was John F. Kennedy, who said that he wanted to cut it up into 1,000 pieces and cut it in and throw it into the ocean. And a couple years later, he's assassinated. I think there's some connection here. So, but at any rate, as the New York Times and other mainstream media pose the question, we are facing a populist attack upon the institutions and ideas of liberal democracy. First of all, let me just attempt to define what is meant by liberalism. Liberalism is the political and ideological banner of the rising and revolutionary bourgeoisie in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. It is wrongly associated with people who support gender rights, trans rights, Black rights. Liberalism is wrongly identified as progressivism and even leftism. That is not what it is. Like if you say, well, my friend is liberal, people like us maybe would be predisposed. Oh, he's a good guy, she's a good person. They support more civil rights, more vote, yada, yada, yada. If you say a person is a conservative, your first assumption, oh, that person wants to cut Social Security, wants to restrict the government, do away with the Department of Education, and a whole number of what we would consider retrograde policies. So liberalism is progressive, conservatism is retrograde. Well, that's all wrong. Liberalism is the banner of a rising class in the 17th, 18th, 19th, and even up to the 20th century, which I'll explain. It is the ideology which opposes the autocracy and totalitarian state of the church. It's not for nothing that in American political discussion and constitutional legal questions, there's always a talk of the separation of church and state. Well, because under the Holy Roman Empire, the church was the state. And the ideology of the church was the state's ideology, to a certain extent. I'll explain it. But so when they say separate church and state, they're saying that society should be governed by secular or liberal values. You can be a Burkean conservative, even up to Ayn Rand type of libertarian conservative, and still be a liberal. You know what I'm saying? Because of the values of liberalism and the values of the liberal state, which then says, and this kind of intersects with Trump's governing philosophy and the appointments of Tulsi Gabbard and Matt Gaetz. And that's why they say it's an attack upon liberalism, because it appears to be an attack upon the liberal state. Okay. And maybe it is. The dislike in elite discursive circles of, quote, what they call communism or what they call fascism, which they equate as the same thing. And what they're saying is that each of them attack the values of the liberal state, which I will explain. But just a parenthesis here. There's reason to believe or to argue that even French thinkers like Voltaire and Rousseau were not liberals in the English sense of the word. And the English definition of liberalism became the predominant one. And I'll try to explain that in a minute. But liberalism is an ideology of a class rising against an old regime. It is not for nothing that we refer to the highest level of knowledge production in university academic education as liberal arts. You know what I'm saying? And freedom of thought, freedom of discourse, and on, that the university is to uphold, is associated with the liberal arts, you know? So liberalism stands for the agency of the individual. In fact, it frees the individual from the state and from the control of the state and its ideology, and says that it is permissible, in fact, necessary, that the individual has the right to criticize the state and state ideology. Okay. Obviously, we've come a big distance from that these days, but we'll talk about that in a minute. It upholds the idea of not just the individual, of reason, of law. And that is why you have to separate the state, which is theoretically organized on the basis of law. In the United States, we have a constitution, which is the fundamental law, but it is frankly the law upon which the state is organized. So if you say, well, I'm going to the Supreme Court, you're saying, or the Supreme Court accepts you to argue before it, what the Supreme Court is saying is that these issues that you want to have settled are constitutional, the fundamental law of the country, and in one or another way are reflected in the state. So the state, which is organized on the basis of law, also exists to uphold the law and to protect the rights of individuals under the law. So citizenship is not insignificant. It has huge meaning, although we take it for granted these days, you know. To be a citizen means to be protected by the fundamental law and by the state. You can see where I'm going with this. So there is a conservative way of arguing the liberal agenda, and this goes back to Edmund Burke and John Locke and others. And there is a conservative way, so-called conservative way. Usually in modern or today's discourse, they'll say The conservatives say, we're standing up for what the founding fathers intended, like you know. And the liberals would say that the fundamental law of the country should be fluid and flexible, relating to the times, you know. So, but they're both liberals, what we call classical liberals. And Stephanie, you understand this. Adam Smith is one of the foundations of liberalism. The overturning of the Smithian Marxian approach to political economy, let us say in neoliberal economic theory, is also liberal. So liberalism is not owned by the Democratic Party or by this or the other movement associated to the Democratic Party. Once again, it is an ideology upholding the separation of church and state, upholding the rights of the individual to think, to do research, upholding reason as a principal definition of what a human being is. Did I say upholding law, upholding what we call these days secular society, wherein pluralism, many views, many approaches can fit into this liberal state formation. Okay. In a certain sense, we might say the first great act in the cause of European liberalism was Martin Luther in 1517 tacking his 95, is it 95? Yes. Something like that. His 95 edicts on the door of the Catholic Church, you know, and proclaiming that man's relationship with God did not have to be mediated through an institution like the church. In fact, he was also saying, and it was a political act, that the state could not undermine the rights of an individual or individuals. And thus, for close, 400 years, there were wars and revolutions and counter-revolutions throughout Europe. In other words, you know, our romanticized visions of the Russian Revolution and the storming of the Winter Palace and all of that type of thing, well, it often doesn't happen that way, and certainly in the bourgeois revolutions to overthrow the rule of the church and of the landlord class and all of their retinue, it took hundreds of years. And there were wars. They sometimes appeared to be wars of nation against nation, but in the end, they were wars of one class against another. In other words, capitalism did not come into the world being pushed in a wheelbarrow by, you know, and say, oh, we've arrived, let's establish capitalism. The church and the feudal system fought tooth and nail. And often it would lead to a compromise, as in the English Revolution, where you end up with what they call a, quote, constitutional monarchy, although England doesn't have a constitution, but where the monarchy, which claimed to be a representative of God and the Church of Peter, and so, or at least associated with that. So gradually the monarchy is limited in its power, and the bourgeoisie expands its power in England. So you get and you get all these different interpretations of the English Revolution. Some people say 1639, 1640 to 1650. Other people say 1640 to 1680. But any way you look at it, it's a long period of back and forth struggle. The American and French revolutions, which come in the late 18th century, both benefit from the English and Dutch and other bourgeois revolutions, and definitely the American Revolution and the French Revolution. But they too are a back and forth in the establishment, ultimately, of the rule of one class and a singular state. But the American Revolution, contrary to what people say, like my friend Harold Horn, that it was a counter-revolution, on any measure of what constitutes a revolution at that point in history, with the task of democracy and separation, not just from a foreign country that controlled you, but to establish a new way of thinking about the state. Highly significant. And the American Revolution was and I'll use this word, some words I use because early in the morning I can't think too well. The American Revolution is a purer form of the bourgeois democratic revolution. Now, of course, the great conundrum is slavery, but we will return to that. But it does not deny the essential character of the American Revolution and the establishment of a new type of state controlled by a different class and different class interest. And hence it was a liberal revolution. And all of the writings of the people in it, the main people, be it Jefferson, be it the Federalist Papers, be it Madison, they are all talking about pretty much the same thing: the establishment of a new type of state that is governed by law and by a constitution, a written constitution, which was approved by all of the citizens of the then 13 colonies who had the right to vote, meaning property owners, But nonetheless, and of course, some of the most revolutionary speeches and statements made by people like Jefferson and maybe Madison, maybe Hamilton, certainly the Federalist Papers, but Jefferson becomes this flame, this torch of liberal values. And those values and those pronouncements, especially as they are embedded in the Declaration of Independence and then the Constitution, are repeated again and again by revolutionaries of the 20th century, like Ho Chi Minh, like Mao Zedong, and of the 19th century, like Marx. These are enduring values. And whether they were fully implemented or embraced by all of society is not the question we want to deal with right now. So, I know this is what Purba will maybe speak about. What in the bourgeois or liberal revolutions do we hold on to, and what is no longer valuable? Now, of course, one of the things that we want to transcend or get away from is the hypocrisy of saying one thing in speeches and on paper and doing the very opposite in real life. But that is possibly one of the internal contradictions of the capitalist class itself. But I just want to say all that just to say that the period of liberal revolutions is, in fact, a revolutionary period, confined though it be to Europe, and from Europe, reshaping in certain ways humanity's sense of itself and the rights of human beings. What we therefore call modernity is the epoch of capitalism and the epoch of liberal values and such. Nobody anywhere on this planet, except if you're, a follower of a cult or something, or live in a very isolated village, no one can deny this. And in fact, the system of knowledge creation and knowledge production institutionalized in the liberal university or the liberal arts is modeled everywhere in the world. And no one would consider himself or herself a revolutionary and deny these values of the bourgeoisie. To do so is a high act of nihilism. And you hear it all the time. I mean, extreme postmodernists say that everything of the modern epoch was useless and oppressive and on and on. You've heard it, But that is not true. And we'll talk about that. But the American and French revolutions are the highest stage, I would say, of the bourgeois revolutions. And this is important for us because to talk about the American Revolution is to talk about an originary for the United States revolutionary moment. So if we talk about three American revolutions, we have to talk about the American Revolution, the Civil War and Reconstruction, and the Civil Rights period. But we can talk about an American revolutionary tradition that is unlike, let us say, the Chinese Revolution or the Russian Revolution, because the history and specificities of the US are qualitatively different than they are. It is fair to say that Russia had not had a successful bourgeois revolution. It was the Russian Revolution that carried out the task of the bourgeois revolutions, which were championed by representatives, ideologues, and so on, of a bourgeois class. In Russia, it is the Russian Revolution, that brief period in China of Sun Yat-sen, where he proclaimed bourgeois and democratic values, very brief. And thus it was the Communist Party who declared the People's Republic, underlining republic, meaning representative forms of governing. People's Republic of China. It was a bourgeois revolution headed and led by communists. It seems like a contradiction, but it's not. And Mao and all of his followers understood what the American Revolution was, what it represented. Ho Chi Minh, the same thing, Kim Il-sung, they all did. And that they understood modernism, modernity, issuing from the European revolutions. And that's not to put Asia or Africa down. It's just to acknowledge that every geography, every region, every civilization does not play the same role at every stage in history. Europe, that was a backwater. At that time, for most of the epochs of human development. There's no great, until the Renaissance and so on, but the great developments in human civilization come from Asia and Africa, for the most part. But then Europe, that is on the fringes geographically of the major centers of civilization, is where the great revolution of the modern world initiates from. And that's not unusual either, you know. The French Revolution is the other example. But these are different revolutions, different bourgeois revolution with different ideologies. Edmund Burke and John Locke are not Voltaire and Rousseau. They are different, very different. One of the great differences is that French philosophy and French theorizing was defined by an understanding of the organic nature of social relationships, as opposed to British thinking, which is based upon the aggregate nature of collective activity, social activity. In other words, British and American thought would say that social groups, society itself, is an aggregate of free-thinking individuals who choose to be a part of society. French thinkers like Rousseau would argue that there is something organic bonding the social solidarity, social revolutions. Let me give you an example. You might recall that Rousseau makes the argument that government must reflect the general will. This is a very important concept. The idea of a general will does not exist in English thought, to my knowledge, in any major way. The English would make the argument it is the will of all, which suggests the will of each individual. The summation of that is the will of all. That's why, elections, voting, the will of all, the aggregate, rather than, which is quantitative, which is addition, one by one, as opposed to the general will, which starts not from the individual, but from the organic whole. Now, each side, for theoretical and ideological reasons, makes statements about a state of nature. Okay. The English thinkers, especially Thomas Hobbes, sees the state of nature as a state of hostility, barbarity, brutality, murder. And that people agree to form a state, a society, in order to preserve, to survive, to protect themselves. Okay? So even though they give up freedom in the state of nature, they gain safety. Yeah. You probably heard some variation on this. Yes, you have. So, people running around killing each other. Do we take guns away or whatever? But it's safety from and freedom from the state of nature. Now, the French argue that the state of nature was a very peaceful, idyllic place. The very opposite argument. But human beings do not form civil societies or a state in order to protect themselves, but in order to create a better situation for all. Okay? So the differing positions on the state of nature is very important. The English believing that individuals decide for the sake of safety, and the French saying that human beings in the state of nature existed in societies, but chose as a group to go beyond the limits of the state of nature, which can only be found in civil society. Okay? Now, in French anthropology, they make constantly a separation between barbarism and civilization. And it's not as bad as it sounds, you know. Barbarism being the state of life, of human social existence before the state, or what we call civil society, civil meaning society governed by law. Okay? And thus civilization. It's not that civilization is so much better unless you take the English point of view, but civilization is a new dispensation, a new way of organizing social life whereby the state, a state, is instituted. Okay? Civilization is always the period where state formation takes place. Barbarism is the state of nature, the state of, well, what Marx called primitive communism. And in fact, there are arguments that can be made and based upon anthropological studies where in Africa, there were the two systems existing side by side. For example, there is in the history, long history of African cultures, nations, empires, a very weak development of private property. All productive land was owned collectively. And each person worked, you know, they would agree to a certain amount of time to produce food and other things for the society. A very weak development of private property. However, I don't think any civilization has developed private property and individualism to the extreme that the West has. Okay? And of course, capitalism institutes this even further. But the French Revolution was even more radical than the American Revolution. And it had many political trends. In fact, the whole idea of the left and the right has to do with the seating of the various factions of the revolution in the parliament. On the right were the more conservatives, on the left were the more revolutionaries. In the French Revolution, you had all of these parties. In fact, the Americans, George Washington and I think even Jefferson, and in the Federalist Papers, argue against political parties because they say they would just lead to further division. You know, but the French, in their revolution, had multiple political parties: the Jacobins, the Communards, being the communists, and others on the right and left. But the French Revolution, whose ambitions were so high and almost took on what could be called a socialist revolutionary character, because there were those elements who were ultimately executed in internal civil wars, and then the rise of Napoleon to bring stability in a revolutionary time. By the way, if this is in our country a pre-revolutionary moment, one can expect enormous instability and struggle and chaos, but we will come back to that. But Napoleon becomes this figure which will unite the French people, do away with the internecine political struggle, but also he goes beyond this democratic, revolutionary and democratic forming of the questions to declaring himself an emperor. You know, and he is going to conquer other societies. Now, everybody was not opposed to him conquering other nations or other societies, because they said on the banner of Napoleon will be written equality, fraternity, and liberty. Yeah, yeah, liberty, equality, and fraternity. And so Beethoven and other intellectuals welcomed Napoleon taking down the feudal states in Germany. But then when they realized that Napoleon was only interested in establishing an empire under his rule, they said, no, man, this is not what we were hoping on. So, so then France descends into a very long period of internal struggle where people are looking. This is what Les Miserables is all about. Jean Valjean and them cats, you know. Wow. But what the revolutionaries were attempting to do is to restore the French Revolution. This is in the 1820s. And so you get this long period that will eventuate in 1870 with Louis Bonaparte, the 18th Brumaire, Louis Bonaparte, and all of this, you know, man of destiny and a farce, you know. And that's when Marx said, yes, history comes twice, but not like Hegel thought. It comes first as tragedy, the man of destiny, and then as farce, you know. Okay, let me keep. But the ideological preconditions of the bourgeois revolution, and this is as important as the events themselves. The ideological preconditions. In other words, it took years, decades, for a cadre of revolutionary thinkers who could advance the fundamental ideas of liberalism and bourgeois democracy. They didn't exist. There were unusual figures that advanced these ideas, but they were usually attacked by the existing regime of the church and landlords, and so on. Such thinkers were Rene Descartes and the idea, a revolutionary idea, if there ever was one, especially at that time, that I think, therefore I am. I am not because I am a child of God, you know, which would be the church. I exist because the church has allowed me or brought my existence into being, the church being the representative of God, and, you know. But I think, therefore I am. My identity is associated with my individuality, with my ability to think, with my ability to reason. You know, and it's not a far leap from that to the American Constitution, especially the first 10 amendments, that protects the rights of the individual. You know, not just establishing a structure of government, but to protect the rights of the individual. And so when Descartes says, I think, therefore I am, in the 17th century, he is literally saying, the church can't tell me who I am. You know, it's almost like today saying, you know, I'm not going to pay taxes because the government is corrupt and it cannot define my civic existence. The English thinkers come a little bit later, John Locke and then Edmund Burke. The German thinkers, who are rationalists, Kant himself is an atheist. Atheism is not anti-religion as much as it is anti the doctrine of the state, you know, and the church, of course. Kant himself supported the French Revolution, but the most revolutionary elements of it. Kant's critiques of reason, critique of judgment, critique of morals and ethics, or so on. Kant has three major critiques. The word critique should be understood as investigation. I mean, I know we've got it kind of confusing these days. When you say critique, that means I'm going to critique you. No, that's not what it's about. Unless you meant it in the sense of I'm going to investigate your being, something like that. It is really a word, a concept that refers to investigating, scientific investigation. His critique of judgment, his critique of pure reason, and his critique of moral, critique of practical reason. Those are the three great critiques of Kant, and they are great. And what he argues, in effect, that artistic judgment, that's what the critique of judgment is. How do you measure art? What is art? What is great art? And Kant felt there could be a rational criteria for it. We can criticize it today and saying it wasn't complete enough. But he believed that reason was the path to judgment and to morality. And out of Kant comes the great systematic theologians of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So, such as Paul Tillich, Reinhold Niebuhr, people who argued that the existence of God could be justified or argued through reason. And then, of course, the final version of liberalism is Marxism. All of this philosophical thinking was grounded in certain movements of art and thought which precede the exact revolutions. For example, the European Enlightenment, the Renaissance in its multiple forms, the Protestant Reformation, which are all of these revolutionary movements and wars that proceed from the struggle to overturn the state power of the church. Hence, there's been a long march to consolidate the bourgeois state, which is the state of the bourgeoisie and its ideas and values. Out of this comes a new civilization and a new form of civilizational state, rooted again in the values of liberalism. And again, they are the rights of the individual, law superseding all individuals and even institutions, reason, science, and the university. Right. The liberal arts university as opposed to the medieval university. Again, the state, which is secular, is separated from the church. And hence, in theory, multiple religions and multiple ideological predispositions can coexist and debate and so on, preferably nonviolently, in a secular state and in a society based upon secular values. Again, this was a long, drawn-out process. The old state is ultimately contained and brought under the law, whereas the church did not adhere to any law but biblical law, theological law, etc., you know, that state is finally eviscerated. Like in England, you still have a monarchy that has no power. And the English people pay taxes so these people can, have horses and walk, and talk trash, Again, I want to talk about uh, four revolutions, and I'll just name them. The English Revolution of the 17th century, the American Revolution of the late 18th century, the French Revolution of the late 18th century, and the Haitian Revolution. I've already mentioned some of the philosophical developments in this period of these bourgeois revolutions, and that's why philosophy is important if properly understood and if you know how to study it. There's one way of studying philosophy which is completely hermeneutic. I use that, but hermeneutics is a method associated with Jewish textual study. In other words, to know the Torah, there have to be highly trained scholars who know how to interpret text. You see what I'm saying? Medieval universities were really about training priests and other church officials, but also those able to interpret the Bible, at least the Catholic Bible, which is not the same as the Protestant Bible. We deal with two different Bibles, by the way. But by the way, the Catholic Bible has more books than the Protestant Bible. And the Catholic Bible, the reason because he's a Catholic and I have to, but anyway, the Catholic Bible has more books and looks at certain disciples of Christ differently than Protestants. And I think one of the figures that the Catholic Bible, I think one of the chapters in the Catholic Bible is a chapter, New Testament, is a chapter devoted to James, the brother of Jesus, who's a quite interesting figure, by the way. But the Protestants don't. There are many what I was trying to get at, there are many philosophical movements within this overall movement of politics, of revolution, and so on. Most students and teachers of philosophy, as I was saying, read philosophy hermeneutically. They read the text. They don't read the context of the text. Like we read Baldwin, but we read him in relationship to the life world of the Black freedom movement. We read King in the same way. We read Du Bois that way. Most departments of philosophy are just totally committed to reading texts, so you don't really understand philosophy as movements of ideas. And thus, the ideological problems that different philosophers were trying to solve. And I want to emphasize the ideological problems that philosophers were trying to address and solve. Doesn't that sound unusual? Because most philosophers and philosophy professors and philosophy textbooks, and if you ever want to be bored, read interpretations of different great philosophers. they cease to be great and they cease to be corpses. You know, like Kant is a dead man in his, coffin. There's no life. But what was he trying? Why was he using reason to solve the problem of morality or address how do we arrive at a moral place, the moral imperative? Or John Locke, why did he make property the foundation of happiness? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Pursuit of happiness is the pursuit of property, the pursuit of wealth. Why did Thomas Hobbes, for example, say that the state emerges out of a state of nature, of barbarity and brutality? What were they saying? And did these words have specific meaning for that time and the conditions of their societies at that time? And even if we lift them from that time and apply them to now, we have to know what is specific and what is general. And thus we do justice to them. For example, if I say that Immanuel Kant was not just a writer of philosophical critiques, but he was an atheist, that he never got married, that he supported the ultra left wing of the French Revolution. Knowing this about him makes sense of what he was trying to do. Or Hegel, coming out of Kant. Why did he, invent a different logic to the logic of the church and the logic of Aristotle? Why did he do this? And I would just say, so Aristotle's logic, what they call Aristotelian logic or symbolic logic, is the logic of identities. I don't care where you go up to today, you can do AI, you can do algorithms or, zeros and ones for computer. Well, I turn the floor over to Samir and Jerry on that point. But what's up, man? But the idea of a logic that is not based upon identity, but a logic based upon negation. And this is hard for Jerry. The negation of the negation, and he took that part of Aristotle's logic, which was a throwaway, the law of the excluded middle, and he took that and built a logic upon it. But why did he have to come forward with a logic of conflict rather than a logic of identity? I think it is explained by his understanding of the French and Haitian revolutions, and his observation of what he felt were the failures of Kant, especially as Kant, and this is Hegel all the way. Hegel literally cussed Kant out. He said, "You've conceded too much to the English, to Locke and to Hume." He literally said it, man. Now, he didn't use curse words, but you can imagine he was so angry that he would have to go to cursing. But so he says that the English have negated the possibility of knowledge of the thing in itself, the thing as in its essence. David Hume and John Locke said we can only know things as they appear to us. Their phenomenal form, their sensory form. Hegel says we can ultimately know what is not sensorily given. And this is the role of reason in the Hegelian sense. I don't know whether I'm making sense right now. Okay. But I'm saying all of these great philosophical movements
Yeah.
occur within the framework of a larger ideological struggle against the church, against oligarchy, against totalitarianism of the church, by the way. American philosophy is more than not a derivative of English philosophy. And therefore, we usually refer to the schools of thought that are English and American as Anglo-American philosophy. German philosophy dominated continental European thinking up until the 20th century and the rise of Nazism in Germany. It is in that moment that French existentialist thinkers such as Sartre, such as Camus, such as others emerge. And outside of perhaps Descartes of the 17th century, the greatest renaissance of French philosophy is in the 20th century, and it is existentialism. But liberalism, and I will emphasize mainly American liberalism, has gone through changes and crises. The first great crisis of American liberalism was produced by the anti-slavery struggle and Reconstruction. Its first resolution was to amend the Constitution and establish citizenship rights to people who were previously seen as property. But in extending civil rights, civil meaning law-based rights, to the slaves or the former slaves, you were extending it to society in general. And that is why the Civil War and Reconstruction is a revolution in the democratic sense and must be seen as such, and any other kind of articulation is revisionist history and generally just BS, just laziness. It doesn't make sense. The second crisis of American liberalism was in the period of the Great Depression and the New Deal. Okay, that's obvious. The extension of democratic liberties and rights to working people. Franklin Roosevelt's acknowledgement of the Wagner Act, the right of workers to organize, and that the state, and this is very important, this is an expansion of the liberal concept. The state must take action to protect the least of these in society. You know what I'm saying? Whereas classic liberalism wanted the state to be confined to protecting the rights of the individual from the excesses of the state.
So that's the question?
No, not yet.
Okay.
Not yet. Now, and the third great crisis of liberalism was what we call the civil rights movement. Every crisis of American liberalism, or most, have been associated with some form of the expansion of democratic rights. Liberalism is now in a crisis. The rise of Trump, the rise of the movement around Trump, most popularly expressed as a populist challenge to liberal values. You hear it all the time. It is a lazy person's way of talking about this crisis. That populism threatens liberalism, that the values of populism go against liberal values, that populism leads to either communism or fascism. That's the way that's the way they talk. They are right, however, that this is a reckoning point. Either liberalism as a mode of organizing the state and society and managing society and social processes, either it can expand the rights of the individual, including the economic and social rights of the individual, or it ceases to have significance. It becomes irrelevant. And that is what the election this year, in a certain sense, can be interpreted as a rejection of the liberal elites by a, quote, populist, I like to say, popular movement of the people, dissatisfied with democracy and those who claim to defend it in the state. Okay. So liberalism does face a crisis. Two major works in the period of the crisis of liberalism appear. Francis Fukuyama's The End of History and Samuel P. Huntington's The Clash of Civilizations. Those ideas are being debated in so many different circles, but for our work, David Brooke and Ross Douthat. How does he pronounce his name? See, he doesn't pronounce it the way it looks. How does he pronounce it?
Doubted.
Doubtful. But if you see it, it's like do that, which I prefer.
Yes.
It's more ghetto wise. But they are debating, I think, in one or another way, the question of the crisis of liberalism, the end of history, and the clash of civilization. I would just remind you that the state is not just, as liberal theory, political theory has stated, a emergence out of secular society. It is a civilizational institution designed to defend a certain civilization, certain civilizational values. In the long struggle over what liberalism is, the Black struggle has played perhaps the most pivotal democratic role. If you listen to Martin Luther King's speeches, he, in so many different ways, very brilliantly, far more brilliant than I think David Brooks or any of these so-called liberal theorists, Martin Luther King, was dealing with the crisis of liberalism at the middle of the 20th century and how it could be resolved. One of the things King says in the essay, My Journey to Nonviolence, is that
Pilgrimage.
My Pilgrimage to Nonviolence, says he has to go beyond the civilizational construction of the state and of liberalism that Western American thinkers have presented it. And he said, he was in effect saying that to truly advance American society required a reconfiguration of the civilizational nature of the state. And hence he would argue, Gandhi is the greatest Christian alive, which meant that Gandhi upheld the values that were defined in the Bible and in Western democracies more than most Western Christians. But the Black struggle has been an engine for the resolution of an earlier expression of the crisis of liberalism and may inform us in our thinking about this crisis of American liberalism. I think we have made the correct decision that Du Bois, Baldwin, Martin Luther King, and others, but those three in particular, ground a discussion of the liberal state by first of all establishing a distinct chronology which links the struggle for a new democracy to the struggle against colonialism and for a new world order, free of the hegemony of liberal Democrats who have now become neoliberals and neocons, which we can come to in a minute. It's very interesting that neoliberals and neocons, like neoliberals, that's obvious, liberals, and neocons, which are neoconservatives, all agree to everything.
Yes.
So the neoliberals and the neocons, who are both committed to a global US dominated system, which they call a law-based system, and both are committed to endless wars. But neocon and neoconservative, which I think makes the point I was trying to make in the beginning, that you have liberal formations of liberalism, and you have conservative versions of it. Nowhere in the Black social system, one expression of the question of modernity and liberalism in the Black social system is to be found in the works of E. Franklin Frazier, especially his Negro family and US history, and W.E.B. Du Bois. And here I would say his Philadelphia Negro and Souls of Black Folk as just foundational. E. Franklin Frazier and his work is groundbreaking, published in 1939. He comes, as we were talking about in Bandung on Wednesday, E. Franklin Frazier comes out of the Chicago School of Sociology, which in the 20s and 30s, perhaps up to the 60s, was the dominant school in sociology. However, the most productive and perhaps most creative was the Atlanta University School of Sociology, headed by Du Bois. And this is not just a statement, but if you look at what was produced at Atlanta University, Du Bois had a different vision of sociology, which did not adhere to the liberal idea of sociology as expressed in the Chicago School of Sociology. And so E. Franklin Frazier writes this really brilliant, landmark, groundbreaking sociological study of the Black family, and I would put slash, social systems from slavery to urbanization or modernity. And it doesn't sound at all like what Du Bois does in the Philadelphia Negro or in Souls of Black Folk. It sounds the opposite. And I know in the Bandung reading group, they were asking, well, Doc, what? He doesn't sound like Du Bois. And I said, well, he's not Du Bois. He is adhering to a cold-blooded, unapologetic liberalism. That Black people under enslavement were pre-modern. And of course, the long march through slavery and through the destruction of the Black family and yada, yada, yada. And Frazier concludes that all of those values have to be pushed aside. And just a footnote maybe, that Frazier's sociology sounds more like Emile Durkheim and Max Weber than it does like Du Bois. Isn't that interesting? Two thinkers looking at the same phenomena, Black family, Black social system, but they arrive at different conclusions. Frazier's arguing for an assimilation, a rejection of our past, our cultural past, and the adoption of values more in line with bourgeois liberalism, you know, and such, and that the family, the black family, which is highly female centered. In other words, women in the black family and in the black social system have more authority and power than white women in the white supremacist social system. And it doesn't take much examination to see it, how it is executed. And you could just see in the character of black women a strength that you don't see in other parts of the society. But this is historically constituted.
Yeah.
But Du Bois says, no, see, Fraser is saying black people will enter modernity through white values. Du Bois says that black people will enter modernity on their terms, as they are. And Du Bois goes so far because the civilizational context is always there in Du Bois. And like in Black Reconstruction, he starts it, the black worker. But the statement that stands out to me is the slaves were everything African. This is, or he will write in the essay, The Damnation of Women, he will use this concept, the African mother idea. So he's always, or he will say, he writes the souls of black folk as an African. So Du Bois is not accepting uncritically, as it were, Western civilization as the final statement on what is civilized, what is not civilized, and what all of these questions of art, of music, and so on. Du Bois upholds the civilizational integrity of the African American. And for us, we are able, even as we did the interview with Alfie, and and we were able to see certain things that a liberal would not, because we were looking at him with Du Boisian or Baldwinian eyes, And then, of course, among their great contributions, here I'm talking about now Baldwin and Du Bois, is they said that liberalism is compromised, in fact, unto its death by its racism and colonialism. No one is saying that Jefferson was wrong. All men are created equal. The question is, well, who do you define as man? You see what I'm saying? The words are good, but then when you get to the sticky details, it becomes something else. But it's Baldwin that says that the nation will enter modernity only with the elimination of whiteness. And hence, America becomes the last white nation. And by so doing, we achieve our country. It's literally breathtaking when you think about this contribution, to resolve the unresolved, to answer the unanswered, to raise questions that few had the courage to raise. Even the great John Dewey or William James or other Reinhold Niebuhr, Paul Tillich, these great avatars of American progressive thought could not consistently think about, investigate, in fact, build a theory of the future upon a radical transformation of American civilization and hence of liberalism, if it is to survive. Okay, I guess I would end on this. There are no two ways about it. American society is in a crisis, but it is not just a crisis of political parties will this party continue to exist? And not just a question of whether or not Trump will destroy the American government as it currently exists. And I think that we must look at all of this with clear eyes, with deliberate thought, and not to be afraid. I mean, there's no reason. I mean, I know I have friends that are still weeping and crying. I know long-term relationships are breaking up, people being put out. I got a friend, he can't call me until his wife go to work. Because of the delicateness of the situation in the household. One, totally committed to Kamala, and if Dwight is here, I don't want to sit. But no, we talk. But anyway, any critique of the Democratic Party is seen as, well, you can't support Black women, huh? If you can't support Kamala, you can't support me. And if you can't support me, you need to get out of here. All that kind of, how you get tight. And even daughters and fathers are entering into contradiction. But we don't face that in the free school because we were never blinded to the nature of the political process, its contradictions and its crises. And that has held us in good stead. I mean, I think most of us are very calm about the whole situation. In fact, we're not surprised that Trump won, and we're not enthusiastic about Kamala Harris to begin with, or Joe Biden, But so we go forward in the throes of a crisis. I kind of end where I began. Are Trump's appointments, and we don't have to dwell on this because we're talking about liberalism, but are Trump's appointments, especially Tulsi Gabbard and Matt Gaetz, are these appointments designed to so undermine the existence of the liberal state as to change it irreversibly? Are we in a crisis not only of the ideology of the state, but of the state itself? Can American liberalism, as it is construed by university intellectuals, as identity politics, as freedom from society, and you hear this through some of these writings, that the intellectuals no longer feel they have a responsibility to society. In fact, they have utter contempt for the people in a society. Can their sexual, racial, gender norms be imposed upon a society who reject them? Are there experts that they trot out anytime a sticky issue comes up? Can they be trusted? Are they so separated from society that they do not know the people? And they're all saying this now. The Democrats, we didn't know the working class. Oh, surprise, surprise. How can you know what you have utter contempt for? And that's, Richard Rority's great book, Achieving Our Country, I think is worth looking at. So this crisis is a crisis of the state. It is a crisis of the people, the masses rejecting the state, and hence liberalism. I'll stop there. I'll turn it over to Corbin.
You're very hard to follow. I had I don't have very much more to add because sort of very comprehensively went through all of the questions that I was going to raise, but I'll do like a short summary of the things that I was thinking about, because I mean, really, even in the post-election analysis on the part of the Democrats trying to assess what had gone wrong and why it had failed, all of these claims about what Doc was also saying, that people are either racist or they are sexist, and that's and all of these basically in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary, because Trump was the one who made gains among non-white people. Trump was the one who made gains among women. So you have all this evidence, but then this sort of insistence that the evidence does not matter. It's really the ideological consensus that can show the right way is really the opposite of rational. And I think that's the part that confuses me most, is a political, ideological consensus that relies so much on reason and rationality to show the direction forward for society can become so irrational. The other thing is, I in preparation for today's preschool, I tried to study, some like the history, the essential thinkers, especially for the American context of liberalism, like Locke and Mills and so on. But Doc is right. Like everything that you can read is made so dry and lifeless that you sometimes, like, it's very easy to lose sight of what questions they were trying to answer when they really formulated these ideas. And then it's easy to like basically nickel and dime and say that, oh, this is wrong or that is wrong. But you don't see it in its movement forward. Because, yeah, I mean, liberalism at its conception was a revolutionary step forward because it answered a certain need of human beings at that time to deal with the questions that they needed to deal with. But then a theory is not good or bad because it has this or that good or bad elements or ideas. Its efficacy is determined ultimately by whether or not it can answer the need of the times. It can answer or it can explain questions, concerns that real human beings living in the real world might have about the world as it is right now. And I feel like that is really what we consider to be our work. And that was the thrust of the science conference. And Doc is already talking about another science conference that we need to do. But it does become like, it becomes clear that the importance of that task cannot be underestimated. And I think I want to just put some brief questions on the table, which Doc has also touched upon, but then we can discuss more, is what is really the future of liberalism, right? Like, even if you go by the article I was talking about last week, Fukuyama saying, oh, classical liberalism is one thing, but then its distortions into neoliberalism and wokeness is basically what turned people off, because there was no reflection of them in those ideas. But then even classical liberalism, as it stands today, can it really go forward without working out some of the contradictions that have always existed from its conception? And one thing that, in my sort of like crash course study of like Locke or John Stuart Mills, one thing that really struck me is this thing that Mills has, which is called the harm principle, which basically says that in civilized society, the only reason or the only scope for the state to intervene in the rights of an individual is when it causes harm to others. So that's when the state can come in and basically say, okay, no, this is against the law or the common law or whatever. But then the thing that struck me about that formulation is also the emphasis on civilized society. Like, who decides? And Doc was touching upon this, the idea of the connection of liberalism to civilization, because this is something that you mentioned at the end of what you were saying, Doc, is the connection of liberalism to colonialism and slavery, where even though the basic tenet of liberalism was that all men are like created equal and have equal rights in front of God, and also this idea that the highest achievement of the human being is reason or the capacity for rational thinking, there was always almost like a loophole left open where you could decide whether people were rational or civilized based on the framework that the European thought had decided was the only framework for state organization and so on. And I have a lot of questions about this, which I don't think I fully understand this, but this is also informed by the study of Indian history and the Indian state or the pre-modern Indian state, where it wasn't like the state was formulated in Europe. So I think I mentioned this in preschool some time back. Um, the pre-modern Indian state actually was not even contingent on an existing ruling class. The state comes into existence before the existence of a ruling class, which is fundamentally different in my understanding from how I guess state organization would be thought of.
At least I'm
Right. So all I'm trying to say with my limited understanding of all of these things was, I think the judgment of, okay, the Asian or African people can be colonized because they haven't reached a level of civilization or state organization in the way that, within liberalism it was conceived, was always open. And the other thing that we've talked about in American society from its very conception, even though it was based on classical liberalism, its benefits or the benefits of liberty and justice was not applicable or allowed to one ninth of its population, which is the enslaved proletariat. So there's always been this contradiction, which wasn't, I think, sufficiently worked out. And even in the movement forward of liberalism, which Doc was saying, Civil War and Reconstruction, the anti-slavery struggle, but then also FDR and the New Deal, which was an expansion of liberalism to really make its promise of liberty and equality and justice become a thing that is for a whole people. And then, of course, the civil rights movement tries to expand liberalism to a conception of what civilizational basis will America even have? Will it be a civilization that's contingent on materialism and profit and things, war, or will it be a civilization of peace? But even in these analyses that Doc was referring to with Douthert and David Brooks and Fukuyama also sort of counterposing liberalism or the crisis of liberalism with populism, I have a question about that too, where I feel like, yes, it is what we are seeing right now. We are seeing that the rise of a populist movement has, in fact, been very instrumental in delivering this defeat to the liberal order. But then my question is that, can it also not be said that one of the reasons this was possible was liberalism's insufficient capacity to renew itself in engagement with the revolutionary strains of American thought, which is the Black struggle, which is the anti-slavery struggle, which is King, Baldwin, Du Bois, all of this. And Baldwin talks about this in Take Me to the Water when he describes the McCarthy era, and he's talking about the hypocrisy of the liberals and their cowardice in actually being able to take a stand for things they said they believed in, to basically not sacrifice their safety in favor of really taking, the revolutionary edge of liberal theory or ideology forward. So that's one question that I would like to pose: is it really that the biggest threat to the future of liberalism is populism, or is it that it has exhausted its capacity to renew itself in response to the needs of the time? And then the other question that I had was, why now? Why is this happening now? Like after the Cold War, when Fukuyama, this ideological consensus, Fukuyama saying end of history, this is the last man, the liberal man or the rational man is the last man. And since then to now, that consensus was only strengthened in some ways because of some of the things that we discussed last time. This idea of the state, the university, corporations, non-governmental organizations civic society coming together to perpetuate ideas and sort of codify them into the American way of living in some ways, right? But why now? Why now are we seeing this great defeat? And this again reminds me of Baldwin so much, what he says about, the relationship between time and history, where he says that time and history have never seen eye to eye. Time and time and time again, time crafts history in a lie. And even like when he's trying to explain, say, the rise of Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam, during, in the middle of the Black Freedom movement, he says, this is not an ideology or a worldview that wasn't encountered before. The reason why it's so successful right now has to do with time, And anyway, I can read out that quote later on, but basically this idea that time takes doctrines and renders them ineffectual for human beings, right? I think that's sort of what we are seeing today. And it has something to do with what's going on in the world. The rise of Asia, BRICS, the rise of China in particular, I think is very important because here is a whole society, a state, the relationship between the state and society even, that's not dependent on the liberal democratic framework, but has managed to deliver very concrete material, real benefits to people. The alleviation of extreme poverty, 800 million people raised from poverty. So these are all questions that I have on my mind, is how much of this is also like a reflection of the zeitgeist of art, art of the world that we are seeing coming into being. And I think the last question I have is, it's not a question, it's an open-ended question, is where do we go from here? Because of course the university and academia, this is something that we focused on the science conference, is very central to deciding what path is going to be charted out for liberal philosophy and ideology going forward. And I think the essential thing to remember to answer that question is this idea of movement, that things are not static, that, something that was applicable way back when it had a purpose cannot be taken in a dogmatic sense to be the defining feature of our times. And in order to see, I don't know how much I want to go into liberal ideas and identity politics, the individual, and all of that's connection to science and string theory and AI and all of that. We've talked about it a lot and we can talk about it more. But I think the main thing to put on the table is, in all of these theories that the ruling elite or the liberal elite has put forward, there's always a sense that there is an end to the movement of history, the movement of knowledge, and even AI basically being human beings, this is as far as you can go with knowing, and now the rest of it will be machines, it will be artificial. I think it's very important to basically break that, static understanding of knowledge and theory, because if liberalism has a future, it has to basically, first of all, look very soberly at its history and the contradictions it has carried and do something about it, actually engage honestly with the real revolutionary chronology of this country in order to find answers that can allow it to renew itself. I'll stop there. I don't have very much more to add.
Oh, is it? Okay. I think I'm very thankful for your remarks because I think many of us here also went to liberal arts institutions, and there was the appeal of a liberal arts education where you know more about the world and how it works. But then we go through it and it's not what actually happens. I think philosophy at one point in my life was appealing because, and maybe there's a more accurate description of it, which is the study of knowledge, the study of thinking. But then you go in or you take one course or you hear kind of briefly about it, and it is very boring. Something that's dead, and then the people are also just figures on a wall that didn't live in a particular moment or time. And actually, as I was listening to your remarks, I got so excited because there's so many things that you've explained that has completely been overlooked, ignored in discourse in our times to actually explain what the past has looked like in terms of the development of ideas, the contradictions in society. And that would be actually very useful. Instead, what we hear is all dumbed down, and it's very hard to understand these times. And so I think one is just to say, one of the questions that there were so many questions that you had raised, but one of them that really stood out is the importance of philosophy and the importance of philosophy to a vanguard that is actually trying to understand, investigate, and change society. The other thing is the general arc is that you think of philosophy in the United States and you think of white figures. And oftentimes it's not to completely discount, the individuals that you had mentioned, right? Rousseau, Durkheim, blah, 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 blah. And they all sound very fancy and intimidating. And part of it is that there is truth to it. Like what is, and the way you described it, one makes it very interesting, but then it also elevates individuals like Baldwin, King, Du Bois, which is that these are Black figures, but no less intellectual giants, and actually also address these questions of what is the state? What is liberalism? What is the crisis of liberalism? All of this. And so, I mean, there's a lot of details that I'm still processing, but those two, what is philosophy? And then also who is, or not relegated, who is worthy of philosophy and ideas. And then I think the third thing also, and this is more of a smaller point, which is this was very helpful in understanding what the assumptions are of liberalism and the debates that happen. Because even one point that you had pointed, or one point that you had mentioned was the different ideologies of bourgeois revolutions. You had the English and Americans, and you had the French. And their assumptions about human nature also informed what the role of the state was. And it's very informative for our times because you had said essentially that for the Americans and the English, there is the assumption of cruelty and of murder and of and the worst of human nature. And therefore, and so that informs what the role of the state is, which is to protect human beings from each other and from the murder, the violence, that whatever it is, right, that people do or is assumed there. But then there's a different version of human nature, or the state of nature, was it that you had? Yeah, the state of nature, which is the French, that human beings are actually peaceful, idyllic. And therefore, what is the role of the state? In that one, it's not to protect one from each other, but to actually to elevate what is possible of human beings and of community. But that stood out too, because I think in our times, that's a thread, which is that, oh, are people, like, do we need to protect ourselves from each other? Which is like the whole bunker mentality. Or is it, there is the crisis, but is there actually something that is more, that elevates all of us, that speaks to community, or you put it in a much better way, but I'm forgetting it, of social relationships and social bonding, solidarity. And that's essentially what I see as King, Du Bois, and Baldwin building upon too, which is what is human nature and actually what is possible and beautiful about human beings. Not just, can we not move past, but do we all just descend into chaos or community, like King says. But I think I'm just very excited because there isn't this level of discourse to explain our times through philosophy, through history, through the study of revolutionary movements. But I was reading, what was it? Do that? This morning, and he was referencing, he had a recent one, which is like Trump has put an end to this era, recognizing that there's a turning point, a pivotal moment. But in it, he references an earlier article that he had written, which is the age of decadence, I think, or this idea of decadence. And I actually liked how he had described what decadence means. And he said intellectual exhaustion. Exhaustion, which is a society that is unable to create new ideas and see a way out. Instead, it cycles. And that's how he describes it. But that was
cycles.
I don't think he used the word cycles, but essentially he's saying that it's all the same thing, but there is no creativity and particularly of ideas, because he describes technological development so forth, and you're waiting, and we've talked about this, which is that we're waiting for some technical innovation that will save us all, whether it's AI, so forth. But I liked how you described decadence in this moment, and I think this was actually in 2012, as intellectual exhaustion, because we also talked about this at the Zion Reading Group this past Thursday, which is this anti-intellectualism that you also see in society today. This seeing ideas and study as just or I'm losing the words for it, but essentially, you don't study things unless it makes you money, or if it gets you a degree, or blah blah blah. And actually, but what is intellectualism, and what is the study of ideas, and what is its purpose? And I really got out of your description of or your remarks on philosophy and these figures. What context were they talking about? Or what questions were they trying to answer? But anyways, my heart is racing. So.
Yeah, I also have yeah, I also have a question, because I think reading through the articles that we started talking about last week, especially the Ross Douthat one on like liberalism, or what they call post-liberalism, I think is interesting, because this is actually something we've already talked about, but in many ways, the irony of this moment of history is that those institutions that are quote unquote defending liberalism today most resemble, in many ways, like the Catholic Church of the olden days, which is like it's like you essentially have to resort to illiberal means in order to quote unquote defend liberalism. And I feel like that's part of the tension also, and like the confusion, because I often, like, honestly, a lot of times when I listen to Trump and like a lot of like the quote unquote thought leaders in the MAGA movement, they honestly just sound like classical liberals to me. And sometimes actually they sound like New Deal liberals too, at least in terms of their rhetoric. But I think in some ways, because that's also this question of like, I guess the whole, like what we talked about last week, of like the whole of society approach, which has been adopted.
Excuse me, or they try to sound like New Deal liberals.
Yeah, they try to.
They imitate. I'm sorry.
No, they try to imitate that language, but I think, yeah, I guess the confusion of the moment is that essentially it's like, especially after, it seems like after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and this kind of like, yeah, the rise of what has been called neoliberalism, but also essentially instead of like, I guess I don't know, I'm just trying to make sense of like what's being called post-liberalism, and if it's actually post-liberalism, or if it's just more reflection of the crisis of liberalism as a whole, in the sense that like, what all of these, like whether it's like Douthat or like the people that he links to and references in his articles, what they're describing is a phenomenon in which instead of like society being defined by this kind of like clear division between the public, or like between the state and society, or between the state and the individual, instead what they're describing is a process in which like the state kind of like almost expands, and now includes like not just quote unquote the government, but also like universities, like all of these like quote unquote all the institutions of civil society. But that's not really classical liberalism as it was originally construed. And so I think in many ways it's like the move that was made there. And I feel like one of the articles that is linked to in the Douthat one is by this guy, was it Nathan Pinkowski,
Yes.
but he's like looks a lot at like the Clinton administration and like what happened there, where obviously like Clinton is associated with like the rise of or kind of like the acceleration of neoliberalism, and free trade and NAFTA and all that stuff, but also with the collapse of the Soviet Union, there's like kind of this also, I feel like the kind of acceleration of the neocon ideology, in which it's it's like you're leveraging, they have this like new vision, like you're trying to leverage all of these different actors, which is like, yeah, like the official government, but also like all of these quote unquote non-state actors in order to quote unquote expand liberal democracy around the world.
Could I just say something? To mobilize and manage the general population in the United States. I think
and I guess the contradiction of it is that, or the irony of it is that on the one hand, the people who would comprise essentially this like governing class, this network of governing institutions, would see themselves, their self-narrative is that actually we're becoming more democratic because we're essentially trying to include all these quote unquote stakeholders. Like I do marketing, that's like my real job. And like this language of like public-private partnerships, stakeholders, it's like everywhere. It's everywhere in the West. It's like everywhere in terms of how different Western societies are trying to present themselves as like more democratic by essentially being like, oh, like actually it's not just about private interests, and it's not just about the government mandating all these things, but it's about like kind of drawing together all of these like public, private, academic, all of these institutions into
the Democratic Party.
Yeah, in America, the manifestation is kind of not just the Democratic Party as like a party, but as kind of a broad network of like what is being described as like the whole of society approach to governing. But like the irony of it is that what that has produced in terms of the Trump response or the Trumpian reaction is that actually it's like, no, like you say that you're becoming more democratic, but actually it's like we never consented to being ruled by all of these, essentially all these non-state or non-governmental actors who are nevertheless now like becoming essentially the state itself. And I think that's also why, because I remember in September, there was this event called Rescue the Republic in DC, which was a joint collaboration between Rage Against the War Machine, which we had attended last year, 2 years ago. I forget honestly. So it's like Rage Against the War Machine, like the Libertarian Party, like the Movement for People's Party, and then essentially this collaboration between those people and like the anti-COVID vaccine mandate people. And I feel like a lot of these people are like kind of major figures in kind of in like the intellectual constellation of the Trump movement, but their kind of self-narrative of themselves, like we're trying to save Western civilization, and we're essentially trying to save what is left of liberalism, like how they see classical liberalism, and because what they're reacting to is essentially the kind of whole of society approach, or the whole of society move, ironically by the ruling class to save liberalism, but from their perspective, they're like, I guess, just to read, like, this is our movement and our moment to defend and celebrate the values and principles that have made America and the West the freest, fairest, and most productive society the world has ever known. At its heart, the West is an agreement to distribute opportunity as widely as possible and to allow the market to reward those who produce wealth from which we collectively benefit. Our civilization today is in grave danger, and every single principle on which the West is based is under simultaneous threat. This moment demands radical change and requires liberals, conservatives, and independents of every color and creed to unify and rescue the West. And so I just think it's interesting because like this is kind of like, I don't know if it truly represents everything in the Trump movement, but especially those kind of like people who are like the thought leaders in the Trump movement. Their kind of like self-styled narrative is like we're trying to rescue Western civilization and essentially liberalism against what they see as the onslaught against liberalism by the ruling elite, who ironically also have their own narrative about we're trying to rescue liberalism too. And so I feel like that's also where the confusion comes in. It's like, oh, like each side has its own narrative, but it's like, oh, actually, what is the reality of how does the state actually, as an institution, as a set of institutions and relationships, how does it actually govern today? And what does Trump represent, both as an attempt in its own narrative to like rescue liberalism in some ways, but also as a threat to it? And I feel like that's where it's like the open question. In some ways, I feel like part of where I get anxiety of the next 4 years is like Trump is kind of like a chimera where he like, one moment he's like saying all these things and it's like great. Another moment he's like, it looks like he's completely sold out. and like you don't know which Trump is like the real Trump, and maybe he's like all of them. And like that's also where it's like how can you appoint like Marco Rubio and like all of like the worst hawks in the government, or some of the worst hawks in the government, and at the same time like bring in these like supposedly like anti-war figures. But yeah, I feel like this is where I get in some ways like anxious, because like I mean, but this is also like the reality of like like the American people at this point. On the one hand, it's like I don't know, I was thinking about this is the last thing, but I was thinking about this where in many ways I feel like people voted for Trump because on the one hand they're tired of what they associate with the Biden administration, of like this constant instability and all the wars and the uncertainty and the chaos that is associated with the Biden administration. But at the same time, Trump, like voting for Trump itself is also voting for another kind of uncertainty. Like you're voting for, or you're essentially you're willing to step out onto what I was trying to make sense of last week, which is like Trump represents in his own way a kind of zone of uncertainty for the American people, for American society. And the question is, like, how is it going to be resolved? But yeah, I don't know. Just like this irony of like the quote unquote liberal state, in order to protect liberalism, has to resort to illiberal means in order to protect it. But in some ways, it's like you can also trace that with like, I guess, like interesting to compare with like neocolonialism too, and how it's like essentially the West has to resort to certain means in order to protect colonialism, but it's not exactly the same as kind of the classical form I had kind of been born under.
Tony?
Go ahead,
Sorry.
Samir and then Clayton.
Just real quick, because first of all, wow. I really enjoyed that because I enjoy philosophy, but you're also right.
Speak up just a little bit.
I enjoyed that because I enjoyed philosophy. I enjoyed knowing how things work. I had 3 comments, which was what you had said about Marxism being encompassed in liberalism, and the way I've always thought of it, and it's understated in the so-called left, that Marxism is the end result of the Enlightenment, it's the end of humanism. But what's implied is that Marxism is sees itself in European civilization and has all those assumptions. And to go beyond Marxism is to go beyond European civilization. So, okay, I just want to leave that there. And probably talk to Todd about that later. Inside joke. And then what you said about every crisis of liberalism becoming an opportunity to expand human freedom, and how we view the Trump administration. I just thought that was beautiful, but also important in defining how Reconstruction, the Civil Rights, and the Revolution. I don't think we've really done that in previous Saturday histories. And then thirdly, I guess it's just my comments of what I took away was how I view Jimmy Carter, and how Jimmy Carter being a neoliberal. Most people view Jimmy Carter, oh, he's so harmless. He's the only good president. He made up for all the shitty things he did in presidency afterwards. But actually, he's a neoliberal. And when you view him in that vein, as liberalism, that was something that was once progressive. When you view things as purpose in their movement, you can defend the French Revolution and the American Revolution, because some people in the left, they want to give the French Revolution back, and they don't see it as part of a revolutionary process the way we do. So okay, so they say all these things, saying, oh, especially Gerald Horne, who says, oh, the American Revolution was just a bunch of white slaveholders, and he doesn't see any of the good. There's basically the essence of human freedom, that struggle for human freedom, which goes beyond, to bring it back to my first comment, goes beyond the civilizational assumptions of one civilization, and that impulse, the freedom impulse, or however you want to describe it, goes beyond just white European civilization, but it's really beyond Marxism, beyond the end of humanism. That's really the essence of what we're trying to get at and what's important. And then, just finally, it's good to be part of the free school post-selection because unlike other people, where would I be without the free school? I would be miserable. I would be, crying, I would be like, my football team lost and now I have to go out on Monday and, sulk all effing week and not have to be a moany bitch for 4 years. It's just good to, to have a future. This is the point of the science conference was, when you understand philosophy to the extent that you just laid out, you see the alternatives available. You see the real questions put on the table. Most of the left, okay, I'll end on this for real. Most of the left views the election as less stability, as some going backwards, whereas we see, as you laid out, the revolutionary potential of the moment, as seen in history from the eyes of Reconstruction, as seen from the Civil Rights Movement, that opportunity, and just see all we are waiting for is to play out. But the abolition school, they don't. They claim to study Du Bois, but they don't see it that way either, which raises all these further questions for me. Further questions. Okay, nothing more.
I would throw a couple things on the table. First of which I would ask Tony, my question earlier was, could you make a distinction between, because I think this is what we're talking about generally, the distinction over time between personage and peonage.
Could you say them once? Personage?
No.
Personage and peonage?
Between personage and peonage, because we in the discussion earlier, there was some statements regarding freedom and the who define citizens. Okay, so who had the franchise to vote? And they were just discussing the person as having the right to vote. Who had the right? Person having the right. That versus the peonage who did not have the right to vote. And the peonage has always existed and at the behest of the personage. Am I?
Yeah, I hear what you're saying.
Okay. So that's what I was questioning
And-
in your conversation.
Yeah, I don't think that I could adequately answer that question.
And I appreciate you. I appreciate your candor. There is a difference, and I think some of what we're discussing here now, I would suggest, is a difference between personage and peonage, which has been at the root of the conflict and revolution, in that the personage has been the elite and the peonage has been the serfdom. And this is our challenge today, in that we claim to acknowledge and admit the peonage into the equation, but in reality, the peonage is allowing the personage to rule. And the personage is convincing the peonage of their authority. And they're constantly hammering home these messages of who's in charge and who has the authority. So,
Go ahead, sir.
and that would be my, I've seen all this before. And having lived through the civil rights movement, I've seen this whole thing go full circle. So much so that I think of today as, I would allude to Dwight D. Eisenhower told us that all this we were dealing with today was discussed by Dwight D. Eisenhower. If you want to do something, look at Eisenhower's farewell address. He warned us that all the stuff we're dealing with today was going to come to pass. That the companies the vested interests of companies would interject themselves into the government. So here's where you have a person like Elon Musk, becoming part of the government, so much so that his companies are getting paid by the government, and he should never be in government. Technically, there's a conflict of interest that the government supposedly was supposed to guard against from the founding fathers.
Yeah, but Musk isn't new. Like that phenomenon is what has basically defined like, the past couple of decades.
So
And,
I,
like, why
I
is
went
it-
I
why
went
is
back
it-
to
like,
Eisenhower.
I'm not defending Musk, but I'm just saying that like why is it bad if Musk? I'm like I don't.
I didn't
hate
say
Musk.
I didn't say
But
good.
it's like
I didn't say good or bad. I'm saying
yeah.
Eisenhower told us it. So we're what we were talking about. This is recycled stuff. This is not new stuff.
This was what, was.
Let, Samir and
I'm
then
sorry.
Emily and then,
No, I see what you're saying, because you're talking about the struggle hitherto has been, disenfranchised people, let's say the peonage,
Right.
who were, tied only to their land. And this is the importance of liberalism in defending, the French Revolution. The idea that you had rights as an individual and that you didn't have just rights as far as that you belong to a feudal lord on some land. And that was an important step for human freedom.
Right.
But then we get to today, and that struggle for human freedom is still ongoing and unresolved. The black question, even with liberalism, the liberals were completely unable to resolve the black question, questions of slavery, chattel slavery, the worst slavery. And now today, liberalism is in a crisis, and it's no longer, individual rights can no longer take us.
Right.
And this is also the thing about the Enlightenment being bound within the European confines, because now we're going to include a larger humanity. We have to have ideas that'll work. If freedom, is an absolute human virtue and ideal, then it has to be compatible with all humans, anywhere, wherever they go, whatever their social culturation or whatever. Today, liberalism can't answer that question of peonage. Who's the peonage today?
This is what
Tony's
saying.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly.
This is the real,
Which was a good answer.
What do the elites,
On a global basis.
What can the elites who have done so much for us up until now in the French Revolution? Okay, we've come to a point where they don't have anything to offer the people in Kensington. So it must be the people who take us forward into the next ideas. The people who will choose. A lot of the left today has rejected the Trump inauguration in favor of not not in what the people want. The people resolutely said on November 6th, but in favor of the old regime, the liberal regime. And so that calls into question what the old guard, what the old left, all around the world, not just the left in Philadelphia, all around the world, the Congress Party in India, Syria, I'm gonna mess up some names here, Syria in Greece, the Labour Party in the UK, the Pink Tide in Latin America. What have they all missed if they retreat into the ideas of the ruling class yesterday?
Yes.
And if they've retreated, what do we have to do here, this Saturday, right? But also moving forward, what is the ideas that are going to carry us forward? They can't be found in the universities. They can't be found in the philosophers' technical meetings. They can't be found in the texts. Can they be found in the Quran? I dare not say. Well, they have to be found in the lives of working people and what we're spent today. Who are the working people of Philadelphia? Who are the working people of Butler? Who are the working people of, New Mexico? This is a question specific to time and place. But the essential, the
In another setting, I would answer where we need more time.
we have to let Emily come in.
Oh yeah, actually what I was gonna say was going off of Samir's point about what I really took away from like your presentation, Doc, was that first of all, like I forget the word you use, but basically that the origin of America was revolutionary, but also just the way you gave the history of liberalism as an ideology and its impact on humanity. Like what Samir was saying was that in a certain time in history, actually liberalism as an ideology and I guess philosophy made steps forward for the achievement of human freedom. And even in America, in some ways, it was a more pure, in America, like the revolution of 1776 was, I forget the word, if it was pure or a more true form, it was a truer form of bourgeois revolution. And
It didn't have to deal with the fetters of feudalism
yes,
in the medieval.
right, because I feel like this thing of, I think especially nowadays,
But it had to deal with the contradiction of enslavement.
yes, which is the unanswered question for not just Black people but humanity, which is what Samir is pointing out, which is liberalism has made progress, but can we say with confidence today, for example, that liberalism has shown that it has gone as far as it can go and has not answered the most important questions preventing humanity from achieving human freedom for everyone, like not just even for African Americans, but for Americans, and then not just Americans, but for basically the rest of the world, especially the darker world, and I feel like the whole world, which is why people are in crisis, because that's why like everyone, there's a big drama of Brexit, like there's Brexit, and there was like the bankruptcy of the Greek society, and so you see the signs and the fires across the world. But the reason I pointed out the origin of America is because I thought it was really important for us to bring up the concept of that America has a revolutionary tradition and that there have been 3 revolutions. Like the origin of America was not that in some ways that the revolutionary tradition of America wasn't taken forward in time by like FDR. Like it's not like FDR picked it up from like 1776, but actually first you had the Civil War and Reconstruction, that as a second American Revolution. And then you had the third American Revolution, Civil Rights Movement, that basically this democratic struggle that liberalism first put in some ways into America through the Revolution of 1776, that actually it was the Black proletariat, what we would consider kind of like the Black freedom struggle, even the anti-slavery struggle to the Black freedom struggle, picked up that democratic struggle that originally liberalism put in place in some ways. Is how I saw it. And the reason why, okay, and then my next response was also, it helped clarify why it's so important to have this alternative chronology, like basically alternative chronology in America, because the significance of that, with this chronology about those 3 revolutions that you really see in Baldwin or Du Bois or King, for example, but it's all over even like other Black thinkers in particular, that it actually links the American struggle, but most importantly, the American people, like millions and millions of American people to the world. It is that links the American struggle, or like to this day, the 3 revolutions and then the unfolding American struggle to, for example, the anti-colonial struggles or the struggles against imperialism, and then whatever struggles are moving forward, that the American people don't have to forever be the lepers that everyone hates in the world, but instead have a future that brings them back with the world. And then after that, I think what's kind of funny was it was like when you were talking about the importance of someone like the importance of Du Bois, King, and Baldwin as grounding, you phrased it as like grounding the liberal state in today's time, which is kind of interesting word. I think you said that. That's how I wrote it in my notes.
I don't think I said it like that, but go ahead.
Yeah, but basically, that most importantly, that it's people like Du Bois, King, and Baldwin who help answer the unresolved question of what does it mean to be an American? Because in some ways, it's no longer defined, like citizenship is not even a meaningful citizenship, or like this in its relation as it's defined by the state and the Constitution protecting the people of America. It's not even enough of a fulfilling question or answer to what it means to be an American, because someone like Baldwin would say we haven't achieved America yet. I feel like I could like build that out better, but and also that gives more meaning to even someone like Du Bois when he talks about double consciousness, because in some ways he's when he says that African Americans have double consciousness, the African consciousness and then the American consciousness. That in some ways, I feel like Du Bois is raising up, like he in some ways is following the logic of negation in some ways, where he's not rejecting liberalism, but actually negating liberalism. He's not rejecting liberalism, but negating liberalism. And in some ways, like talking about the ineffectiveness of liberalism to help define like consciousness of man, the consciousness of like African Americans and even of the Americans. And that's why Baldwin always talks about the mirror. Then in some ways, it's the African American in America who puts up the mirror of what is yet to be fulfilled, which is not just democracy, but even self-consciousness of like the country yet to be achieved? Are we even Americans? Like what does it mean to belong to this country? And then the last thing is the last thing I wanted to say was with all of this is why it's important to say, like, you have to ask the question, which is like, why is it that more Americans, the whole American people, don't look at something like the civil rights movement and say like, wow, like we have a revolution, we have a world historic struggle and task to make more steps forward to achieving true democracy that wasn't totally fulfilled by liberalism in of itself. And that's the question Baldwin asks. And Baldwin would say the reason why more Americans can't see this revolution tradition as almost like a personal responsibility and like wouldn't that make you be so happy to be like, I have a world historic task, but like my world historic task is to help fulfill democracy, which isn't yet fulfilled in this country. If I can do it just not for this country, but it fulfills something that hasn't been solved even by the world yet. But why is it that more people aren't jumping up and down and saying like, damn, like I was born, me being born in this soil means I have like a great task to fulfill. And I feel like the reason why, as Baldwin would say, the reason why is the ideological weapon of whiteness. Is that the reason why you can't see it is because of this ideological tool of whiteness, which makes you feel like I don't have a shared responsibility. And in fact, I am out and that's why Baldwin always talks about why is it that people say Negro problem when we don't have a Negro problem, we have an American problem. We have an unfinished American struggle. And why is it that no one wants to pick it up? And because I wanted to end with King, because you brought up King's pilgrimage to nonviolence, because like in a lot of ways, King is like he kind of brings, King never says like King doesn't take the socialist line, for example, like in the face of the unanswered question of like, America was founded on a revolution. We made big leaps in like achieving more freedom than like in the feudalism of Europe, et cetera, et cetera. But we've only been able to go so far. King always makes this thing. I feel like what King addresses is not, he doesn't say capitalism in of itself is the problem that has to be solved. But instead, like when you read King or Du Bois and Baldwin, you get the sense that they're identifying the unresolved questions inadequately resolved by liberalism. And yeah, I don't know. I wrote my notes because I thought that was deep. And then,
It's very important.
and in some ways, it's kind of like, I just think similar to what other people are saying, I feel like the picture you painted, Doc, it's both astounding because it really imbues both the Black freedom struggle, which is not just for Black people, for the American people to pick up. It imbues it with a world historic meaning and world historic implications, which is why, for example, King is the man of destiny, and then you have Trump is the man of farce. And the existence of farce means that we as a people have missed something, overlooked something, which is destiny
Right.
that still exists, but we haven't picked up. Like the existence of farce, the second, means there was an unresolved question, an unresolved struggle. And which is why you have to go back to King and the Great Black Freedom Struggle, because that is where the future of not just the American nation, but it is also where the future of humanity being able to begin to like make the big steps it has to make in the long march towards freedom in this world possible.
I just wanted to add to that. This is also what I was trying to get at last week and today also, in saying, can it renew itself in engagement with the revolutionary strains of thought in America, which is really the Black struggle, which is, and honestly, like without knowing too much about liberalism and then trying to study it, it sort of astounded me that you sort of reached the same conclusion when you posed the question of what is the future of liberalism that we reached when we talk about American democracy or even modernity. And the central contradiction always comes to whiteness. You know, the idea that something about whiteness or what it does to the human being, what it does to their way of seeing the world, distorts even, something that started off as being revolutionary into becoming blind and not able to take you to the future, and yeah, I mean, in some ways, the crisis of liberalism cannot be, I don't think it can be resolved without taking a cold, hard look at its, I guess, like interconnectedness with whiteness. And especially in the latter forms that liberal politics and ideology has taken with identity politics and, the university and so on and so forth. I don't know if somebody else wanted to speak to that. I have another point. Oh, yeah.
Sort of to like Emily earlier on talking about like achieving the nation. So something that like Emily was talking about earlier about like achieving our nation and thing. So I just want to start with saying like it helps a lot looking at like the ideological trajectory of like world modernity, and trying to understand working off of liberalism as a foundation for this country. I guess I look at that because if it's moving to the individual and the rights and like a society organized around the individual, it makes sense then that there's this contradiction of who's the individual, right? Which I think we were talking about earlier with personage and peonage. And as we see, that was insufficient that's insufficient to build a country off of if the individuals, like, the humanity is not given to everybody. So if the state's organized around that, and that's not working anymore, like the pursuit of property and happiness and things like that, then that brings up a new question about what is like the foundation of America, what is the contract that, and even the identity of America, if we organize around the individual and only specific, then how you say, yeah, like what then is the contract and the relationship between the people and the state? Like what really unites or gives character or identity to a nation, because it can't be an individual, whiteness, you could say, I guess. So it makes me think that like certain things that Baldwin and King were working with, for one, about who's a human being and who deserves that, but then there's this, I don't know, it's an interesting back and forth between like the second revolution and the third one, and I guess even the fourth, because when we're looking at like certain movement in history right now between Asia and Africa, like I feel like there's this question that King brought up, or that King was bringing up at the same time as trying to answer like the identity of like human being and people, also the relationship with the world. When King talks about a single garment of destiny, and how, when he talks about like famine doesn't have to exist, like poverty is engineered, there's a certain cooperation. that could be happening with the world to deal with these human problems if you position yourself in a certain, like amongst humanity. And I think that's kind of, it happens at the same time. I feel like if you're asking the question of like, who is humanity in your own country, it makes sense that it would lead to the world as well. And I think that's like the interesting and beautiful gift of like Black tradition and dealing with that, like you can't stay at the individual anymore, or stay at even your country, or stay at even, I guess the liberal consensus has existed to just uphold white supremacy in the Western world order now. At least that's how I interpret the rest of the world. And people are like, why is like Europe going down with the ship? I think they're protecting that liberal consensus and protecting that white order, and so it just has to expand, basically. But I don't remember what else.
If I could add to this enriching discussion on the individual, it was very explanatory when you said that when liberalism faced a crisis, particularly like, for example, let's take civil rights, they had to expand who was considered an individual and what those individual rights corresponded to, which, I mean, I remember, for example, when we're talking about like the abortion, like that was even founded on the rights that were established during the civil rights movement. And so
Actually, the 14th Amendment, going back to the anti-slavery.
Carrying all that forward. And so that has been the expansion. And I guess with certain when faced with certain contradictions, expanding who the individual is, having to deal with Black people in this country and what that individual deserves, has yielded certain results. But the ineffectiveness of, for example, I take central in the individual and the rational individual. Like I feel like that in itself was not strong enough for there to be not the impossibility of what this country has done to Black people and what the Western world has done to the darker peoples of this world. And so like this rational individual, the assumption doesn't even hold, because I mean, some of the stuff is irrational. Right. And like this is part of what we were getting at when we were reading The Fire Next Time this Thursday, where like Baldwin is putting the Nation of Islam's worldview counter to like the white world's worldview. And part of it kind of does like spell like destruction, like God is going to strike down and annihilate the white man. And like he's like, oh, but like and everything that the Nation of Islam is saying is like, it's true that the white man is the devil. Like the Black experience corroborates that. I cannot say anything in contradiction to that. And yet, like with just rationality, Baldwin is not satisfied with that and wants to move forward to a new stage of history, in spite of what the rational might think. And so, like this, I don't know if it's too simple to say morality or belief, but there's something about this rational individual that is not enough, that I see in James Baldwin even, that comes out of the Black American experience dealing with these central contradictions. Okay. My small but excited point.
Say something along this line. I was thinking about this earlier, and these two comments together brought it back to me. Where, if Corba, you're asking what is the future of liberalism, I wonder if the category of the individual is any longer useful, and if the human being is a more useful way to think about. We say, what are the rights of the human being? And similarly, if reason or rationality is a civilizational virtue of liberalism. Is it also enough anymore? Do we need a concept like love? What is the difference between, not that love and reason are incompatible, but love and whiteness are incompatible. Love and the human being are incompatible in a way that whiteness and reason or whiteness and the individual are not incompatible necessarily.
Wait, can I? This is very exciting. I've been thinking about this thing about the rational individual a lot also, because I mean, I'm also like in the sciences, right? So this is supposed to be bread and butter. But then how is it that when Du Bois is talking about law and chance and he's talking about human agency, he says there is something in the human being that's incalculable. Incalculable. Baldwin says it too when he's in This Far and No Further, when he's talking about the relationship of the individual inside societies and their relationship to the state. He says that there is something almost like restrained, inchoate, waiting to come out in the individual that at one day can rise and say, this far and no further. Right. This has gone on for too long. And we're seeing that really unfold concretely in front of our eyes today. But then, again, this question of rationality and reason is very deep, I think, and needs to be investigated much more than it has. Because I feel like a distortion of what reason looks like or rational thinking looks like also leads you directly to AI. Because without really understanding the basis of human thought or human intelligence, you think you know what rational thinking looks like, or the logical steps that you would go from point A to point B to point C in an argument or as answer to a question or whatever. And I think that's how it becomes so simple that you can imagine that you can replace the human being or the human brain with a machine, and to see these things as separate, isolated things is very dangerous, because you have to see them in their whole as coming from a worldview or a philosophy that has considered, the white way of thinking or the European mode of thought as the only possible progression of human thought and civilization. And that is why, from the very beginning, when we started talking about this question of the crisis of liberalism, and so many different kinds of people, conservatives, liberals, trying to deal with this question, the thing that's really missing is really to tie those two things together. European thought, white civilization, Western ideas, but also white ideas being so interconnected from its conception to liberalism. And I think what we've been talking about, Marxism also in some ways, not being able to fully explain the world today or the path forward for human beings today. I think in some ways it's at that intersection that we run into these problems that needs working out. But I just wanted to say that thing about rationality. And the other thing is the question of authority. Who has authority in the liberal state? And in the Ross Douthat article that Alice, you were talking about, the one before, where he, or maybe Jeremiah was talking about the post-liberal, sort of like the bringing together of so many institutions with the state and civic society to basically serve, the social system. That's what we would call like maybe the white supremacist social system. But then he poses, or maybe it's a little different, but then because he doesn't talk about whiteness, right? But the other thing is he poses a sort of conundrum there that I thought was very interesting, but didn't know what to think about it. Where he says that if you take like the trans movement or so on, or you take this phenomenon where like children almost were given surgeries or medication or whatever whose long-term effects there just hasn't been enough time to gauge. What allowed this hasty movement towards something that nobody knows what the long-term effects would be, but also we have enough evidence to know it's really been harmful. What made this possible? And he asked this question: who is really the one in authority here? Is it the state? Is it the Democratic Party who's making the policies? Is it the activist? Is it the medical associations? Who is it? And I guess the answer would be all of the above, because they work in like tandem with each other to make sure that certain ideas are basically passed without, any democratic debate or consensus. And that's also the big role of the university. But then, funnily enough, this is something that I get a lot of pleasure out of. When, Kamala Harris, when she was campaigning, she was like, oh, my economic policy, 25 Nobel laureates in economics endorse this policy. Who is endorsing Trump's policy or whatever? But what did the American people do? They said, so what? That's what they said. So what? So what if 25 Nobel laureates said this was the best policy? We do not see the evidence of its benefits in our own lives, in our children's life. And in some ways, this is really like, I don't know, it's makes me really happy, but it's also a question about, I mean, this thing about, I think maybe Jeremiah, you were talking about it, this idea that, oh, there was this uncertainty, but that there's a new uncertainty with Trump. I actually feel like the Trump part definitely is uncertain, but I think there was a level of certainty in rejecting the authority and the legitimacy of the Democratic Party. I don't think they're like equivalent, like it was a rejection, a clear rejection of something, and an embrace of even uncertainty to allow that to be possible. And we have to say it like that, because the university is going to have, a big problem on its hands right now. What does it do with all this expert knowledge that it has shoved down the throats of people for so long? And for people who resisted, they'd be like, oh, you're deplorable. You're basically like, you're so stupid. You don't even know this is good for you. We are telling you what's good for you. And where does all of that go? And what do you do in the light of this like resounding defeat of your authority and legitimacy over the people? I don't know. And the other thing is you can't take anything for granted, because the ruling class is dangerous. And we've not seen the end of this.
I just want to say one quick thing if I could. One, I'm sorry I was late, but I was listening to you on my iPhone. I think Samir raised a question that is really close to me, and that's what we do today, with all of this stuff. My sense of it is, and vast majority of people I come in contact with are Black folks. My sense of it is that there is the experience of a heck of a lot of chaos. And, in a sense, any kind of system that's a system helps you to cope with chaos, even if it's the wrong system, you know what I mean? I think there's a lot of fear. And both of those are understandable. My guess at what needs to be pointed to, at least what I think needs to be pointed to, is something about, well, I was 12 years old when Emmett Till was killed. And before I turned 13, the bus boycott started. And something, it probably didn't click in my head as a 12-year-old, if you know what I mean. It took a while. But something told me these two things are connected. Something awful has happened. And then over there in Montgomery, people have decided they're going to do something, right? I think the part of what we got to do is to remind, at least for myself in relationship to Black folks, to remind us of that third revolution, to remind us of the fact that there was a time when we were able to come together and do something that expands this business about what the hell it is to be a human being, that expands this business about, what it is to have dignity and all this kind of business. Other thing that crossed my mind is, I saw this documentary on the Wilmington massacre.
1898,
Yeah.
November 10th.
Yeah. And I was talking to my younger sister, and she was telling me, or reminding me, that our grandfather, who was born before emancipation, and somehow managed to become a relatively successful I mean, truth of the matter is a damn successful farmer in rural Georgia. He, in all likelihood, as a Republican, right, on before emancipation, a member of the party of Lincoln, he, in all likelihood, knew about Wilmington. He probably knew about their Atlanta rights, program in Atlanta, and he probably knew about a whole lot more stuff that's going on. The name of the game is that he didn't throw in the damn towel. Yeah, I mean, the name of the game is that if it weren't for him, damn it, there wouldn't have been the generation, in my opinion, that was responsible for so much of what happened in the 60s. And somehow, I think there's got to be that struggle to understand that we, and when I say we collectively, I don't mean just Black people, I mean all of us, period, can't throw in the towel in the midst of fear and chaos and stuff like that. And I think we've got to begin to get that broader understanding that, thank God, came out of the movement to some extent, that broader understanding of our relationship to what was happening in Vietnam, what was happening in Palestine, and things like that, what was happening in South Africa. That we're hooked up in that somehow. How the hell we are hooked up in it? But those are our brothers and sisters. You understand? They're part of our historical struggle. And the future of the struggle involves folks from all sorts of other places that have been catching the same kind of hell out of this sad system that's evolved, that so many folks throughout the world have been subject to. But you just can't throw in the damn towel on this kind of thing. I just said one more thing. I think you guys got some stuff figured out. I think Baldwin strikes me as being incredibly close to that, and probably got his finger on it better than I understand. And I'm appreciative of what you of your appreciation of your voice. Because I don't think I really gave him the credit that he with. But you know, yeah, you guys are doing good stuff. Hanging. I got to get the heck out of here.
Every time.
Good to be here.
Can I say one thing quickly?
Yeah, go ahead.
Just that I think a lot of what we get from people like Baldwin or Du Bois or King is not just really the concept of rights, but of responsibility. In many ways, because I guess in some ways, like I see the civil rights movement as, on the one hand, bringing liberal democracy as far as it could go, essentially, like taking it as far as it could go, and at the end point or at the exhaustion of liberal democracy, essentially beginning to form like a new kind of democracy, like a new kind of democratic spirit and vision. And I think that's part of just like the kind of dialectical movement of history. But I think this question of responsibility is important because it's like, you could take two examples. One, deindustrialization. Do companies have the right to essentially leave? Do they have the right to leave and take their labor elsewhere because it's cheaper? Under the liberal framework, yes, they do. But on the one hand, it's like, is it possible to say, actually, there must be some kind of new social contract, which is not just based on, like the rights of companies to like employ wherever they want. And it's like, I don't know how much that can actually be legalized, but I feel like in some ways this is part of like where the liberal framework fails to actually capture what is necessary for a society to like to actually like grow or to be prosperous, whatever. I think the other kind of where the liberal framework fails, which we've already talked about, is like the question of war. Because it's like, on the one hand, do Americans have the right to essentially consent to like an imperialist genocidal government? They have the right to consent to it, but what are humanity's rights? And it's like, on the one hand, it's like, if you look at it, I guess, really concretely today, it's like, maybe yes, we have legal rights, which are it's like actually not really bothered by like the war machine in some ways. It's like you like actually it's very possible to live like a happy existence, to pursue life, liberty, pursue the property while your government is committing like mass murder abroad. But there's a deeper, I feel like the basic moral recognition is that there's both a deeper right of humanity to not have this imposed upon them, and a deeper right of humanity to not allow like yeah, I guess to not allow that to happen. But on the other hand, it's like part of what we are trying to work out is like there. It's like Americans. I guess yeah. I guess the way it is like Americans have no right to do nothing. If that makes sense. But it's like that's not a legal right. That's like a moral. That's essentially a moral imperative. But it's like that's something that can never fully be enshrined in any kind of codified law. But this is where it's yeah, like the liberal framework fails because it can only really conceive of like rights and all that based off of like what is codified in law, what is protected in law, which makes sense. Obviously, there's reasons for it. But like where I feel like yeah, like essentially America is today, it's like okay, do all of these all the American people today like maybe yes, actually legally you may have a right to do nothing in the face of all this. But what is your moral like what is the actual moral imperative? And I feel like this is where it becomes difficult, like because how do you envision a society in which things are both like I guess part of the common framework of how human relations are structured, but it's not something which is ever fully codified into like a legal system, for instance. Like what we call the moral imperative can never fully be, and this is where I feel like King was also thinking a lot about where it's like there's actual like because he would talk about like actual law. I think he would talk about like the law that's written on the human heart. But it's like I think that's where the struggle is because it's like, oh, like how do you actually articulate that to people? And this is where I feel like also like what Reverend Ike was saying, I feel like the whole kind of like grounding or the kind of motive force of the freedom struggle is yes, the desire to actually be seen as equal citizens under the law and all that stuff, but actually like when you're part of a people who have been enslaved and who have been oppressed, it's like not just about the rights thing, but it's actually no, like I have a responsibility. But that's something that can never fully be kind of captured in terms of the kind of liberal state framework. But that doesn't mean it's unnecessary. In fact, it makes it more necessary today.
Makes what more necessary?
Like essentially the concretization and like the realization of essentially a society or a civilization which recognizes like maybe not a moral, like an actual moral law per se, but a kind of moral imperative or kind of or like a basic kind of social contract built around not just rights but also responsibilities.
Right. I mean, I wanted to say something to this. I mean, I was thinking of this also because like to go back to what you had initially started with. I think two things really stood out. One was the idea of the distinction between the will of all of the British liberal thinkers and the idea of the general will, and the fact that you were mentioning existentialism as an important like philosophical development like that comes out of Europe. And I was thinking this is precisely the question of the individual, because what existentialism was, I think, faced with was faced with the fact that the individual was not determined entirely by rights, but the search for meaning is a rational impulse for the individual. And therefore, but at the same time, the existential thinkers were still, I think, like they were still limited in their, like they were still European, and they were like their epistemology was still limited to, I think, largely the British liberals, in that they saw the individual as solely determined by um, like in terms of rights and so on, what the state has promised them, and then they're faced with a world where the state has failed them, like the post Second World War Europe and so on. But this question of what the individual represents and like what is the individual need of the time, I think it's a yeah, it's a deep question which is not resolved now, and especially it's like thrown out at this time. But I think at the same time, the other question that also, I mean, like what the whole discussion made me think was also about the idea of the liberal state and what is the legitimacy of the liberal state, because like the liberal, the liberal state comes out of, like you were saying, the French and American revolutions, which is a rejection of the state based in the legitimacy of the church. So the legitimacy of the church is clear. It's worked out. It has it. I mean, regardless of how it represents the rights of the people or not, the authority of the church and the legitimacy it sees in, that people see in the church, that is unquestioned. But I wanted to ask if, the fact that the liberal state has not worked this out, has not worked out what the basis of its legitimacy is going to be, and it only gives a partial answer in terms of individual rights and so on. Whether this has to do with the fact that liberalism ultimately was, it was merely a rejection of the feudal and, the whatever older forms came in, but not a negation, as as we are talking about, in terms like not a negation of, and like a negation is, I mean, like I'm drawing the distinction that Emily was drawing also, that the idea of the negation comes, like Hegel's idea of negation and the negation of the negation. Essentially, you have to come to realize that that like essentially the movement of ideas, and therefore what is a current form of government or a current like system of legitimacy of ideas, like to move beyond that is not simply a refutation of that, because then that's when the whole idea of history repeating and all of that, I think all of that comes in. And I think the whole question of the liberal state, it shows that, I mean, it contains the seeds behind the current hysteria that's coming out in all of these, people like Dowthat and Brooks and so on, because they are like their first time faced with the question, like, okay, like liberalism, I think for them was a complete movement forward from the older feudal forms of being, like forms of state relationship. But I think, like what I'm thinking from our discussion now and for some time is that it did not move away from it. It rejected aspects of it. It identified the individual as the central motive force of history and so on. But it did not work out the relationship of the individual. It did not work out the relationship between the individual and the state, which was, I think, which was worked out maybe in a more primitive form in the feudal. Yeah, go ahead.
Wait, you're starting to connect some things that I feel like you jostled so many thoughts in my mind. So it took me so long to start to formulate some of the questions that you were even talking about before getting to preschool. But I think you helped lay the groundwork for some questions that I was hoping I could pose to, which was, I think I started asking myself about like the liberal state actually, because when we started having this foray into liberalism and modernity, I thought, what an interesting topic for free school. Is it because we encounter so many so-called liberal people in our day-to-day lives who are going to have such a overblown reaction to Trump, and it's because of their assumptions that need to be teased out, even like person to person. But actually, the level that we're engaging liberalism is actually so deeply like embedded into the American state, or even the Western idea of a state, and then and I think that was a level that I'm now really trying to work out or think through, because I feel like the questions around even what makes a liberal state, what gives it an authority was what you're asking, but also what must we do
Or legitimacy.
Legitimacy, when even from the very beginning, of course, it could not even answer its own contradictions. And I appreciated what you, the question I was most gratified that we talked about today, among other things, were those different challenges to liberalism throughout America. in like the crisis in this country, and you had mentioned like the anti-slavery and Reconstruction period, the amendment of the Constitution, the New Deal, the Civil Rights Movement, and then now. And I think the two questions I think I'm starting to ask are, I think we're starting to ask ourselves what not only like what must happen to in some ways transcend or move beyond the liberal framework and create, I think, a new sense of people's governance, or we're looking for ways to describe as a new nation, transcend whiteness, in the Baldwinian terms, but also I think you're starting to, the other aspect of it that I was starting to be curious about came when you were talking, Doc, about how it was the Russian Revolution that, and also you could include the Chinese Revolution, but also Kim Il-sung, Ho Chi Minh, and many other movements that also like took up, I think, a lot of liberalism, and in many ways took up this task of the bourgeois revolution, but went beyond it. And now I'm starting to ask myself, like, if we are asking this question of what the liberal state needs to, or what we need to do here, there's also, I'm just trying to fit in basically how we have been talking so much about the civilization state. And this is where I know I don't have the, I think I'm getting into deeper waters than I can, which is to say, is there something that we could say, even the framework of the civilization state answers or addresses that the liberal state cannot? I don't know the answer to this question, but I think this question is about like rights and responsibilities. I mean, the idea around the individual, but actually instead recentering the human being, the idea that the civilization in, I think, a more liberal sense of what it means to be modern, actually civilization might be considered pre-modern in most, I feel like, definitions, but actually what we're saying is there were things, one, like that were worked out in the quote-unquote pre-modern that cannot be discarded for this moment, and in fact they might point to more advanced or more like the necessary kinds of values or frameworks that we need for this time, and to actually advance like modernity. And then the other side of it is, even as beautiful as that sounds, is there something that's still to be worked out as the stage of what we think the civilization state or civilization needs to look like if America does not actually work out its own, like all these other countries can work out their idea of a civilization state, but would it be able to flourish if America does not transcend white, it remains how it is, it would not be like I'm losing my words, but it's also that can this truly be complete? Can this transition truly be complete, or like can world humanity achieve modernity with like this with the rest of humanity like having a response to liberalism? That's what I mean. That's how I'm seeing it. Without the U.S. or the American people also having our own.
Why? I guess why?
Can I just say, if you don't mind, just one. I think that is what we have to go further on, because in my presentation, I did not resolve the question of what would the future look like. And certainly, even if you take the Russian Revolution, after the Russian Revolution, where they proclaimed, quote, the rights of man in one or another way, I don't think either the Russian or the Chinese Revolution or the Indian independence movement have gotten beyond liberalism. Yeah. And we're in the throes of a deep crisis in this country, which I think it's fair to anchor or to understand this crisis from the standpoint of the ideological crisis of the nation, of the civilization, and how will it be resolved? And one way of looking at the ideological crisis is the crisis of liberalism, because liberalism is philosophy for the organization of the state and the organization and management of society. Religion is the religion of the liberal bourgeois revolution. Protestantism transcends Catholicism or the Holy Roman Empire because it marches forward with the banners of liberalism, of bourgeois democracy, whereas the church, the Catholic Church, was late in embracing these values. I think it took World War II. I mean, you know, they were standing hardcore against the transition to liberalism. It's so interesting, but they quickly changed after World War II with a lot of baggage that comes from the feudal period, such as the abuse of children. You know, where children didn't have rights and children, or even their pedagogy, the pedagogy in Catholic schools, which is, well, you know what that is. Which is the other question of the, I don't know if everybody has seen the article by David Brooks in The Atlantic on higher education. I know Shantanu has, he could probably speak about it. But the university is pivotal to advancing the values of liberal democracy, of liberalism. Without universities to educate, in this instance, we're talking about the elite, the Ivy Leagues, the third, what Brooks calls the 34 dominant elite universities, from which presidents and CEOs and everybody, professors and so on, come from. What happens when the universities are exhausted? They don't produce anything. The students have turned against them, and the university administrations have turned against the students and the right to dissent, which is foundational for liberal arts. I mean, that's what liberal arts is supposed to teach. What they call critical thinking or the right to dissent. We protect your right to disagree with your professor, with the administration. And then we saw them attack this spring.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? And so, you know, I know there's discussion in Lotus, at least I've heard, but I would say this, it's hard. I mean, I would be more, my tactic, I'd be very patient with these students. You have to think what they have gone through. And so many of them are on the verge of, or live their lives in trauma. I mean, I just cannot imagine it. Young kids, literally, whose lives are organized around trauma. And it's not the trauma of poverty, but it's the trauma of the assault upon the soul. And to say to you, you can get paid well, but you have to be obedient. So these are some of the questions, you know, I would raise, but certainly I would say, Kathy, the problem, now we're in the crisis. It's no question as Trump puts his administration together. And again, the two key figures are Tulsi Gabbard and Matt Gaetz, you know, the head of national intelligence and the head of the Justice Department. And Trump will be, the command center will be the White House. And this is very important because I don't know of any president after Lincoln in the time of war, as it were, civil war, that has governed or ruled from the White House, overriding the houses of Congress, overriding the Supreme Court, and on and on and on, in the name of bringing down the existing liberal state. And I put quotes around that. So this, I mean, I think I would agree with Scott Ritter up to a point, and I would say more than a revolutionary moment, we are in what looks like a pre-revolutionary moment. What all that entails, we do not know. But it has features of a transition from the old to something new. I'm sorry,
Well,
Joe.
because this was partially responding to your point. I guess why can't we see liberalism as a negation of the feudal system
Yes.
that yet has not? I don't know. I just feel like it's fine. To me, it feels fine to say that it was revolutionary for its time.
Yes.
And like it actually did negate the European feudal system, to not really say anything about like Asian or like African modes of social organization. But I feel like, I don't know, I guess that's just like a minor thing of like why can't we say that it negated like, the feudal
Well, why
system?
can't the ruling elite say it? Because it is the ideological thing that they hide behind. If they say we are liberal, we are Democrats, we are doing this in the name of democracy, it prettifies their crimes against humanity. For instance, like the Israeli state saying we are carrying out genocide in the name of self-defense. You know?
Right. And I guess, well, the last one I had was actually like this question of like the pre-modern
Yes.
is important in some ways because maybe not that like the goal is to just like try to recreate the pre-modern societies of like Asia and Africa and America, but like the thing that I feel like is distinguished between the pre-modern era and like what we call the modern liberal state, or like the secular state, is like, yeah, again, we're not trying, I feel like the goal is not to introduce like a theocracy or something.
Right.
But the truth is that like if you take scripture, for example, scripture as again part of the foundation of what was then like the Christendom, right? It's both in some ways, I feel like there's parts of like the Old Testament that talk about like certain rights or like certain like you have the right to resolve certain conflicts with like other people in the community, like do this. A lot of it's like around like agriculture and stuff. But I do think the important part of it, which can be in some ways kind of derived for like a new modernity, is like maybe not scripture as like actual law, but something that regulates behavior, or it's like obviously like the Bible is there to act as like a set of moral principles and codes for people to live by. But the question is like, what does it actually look like in a modern situation, as opposed to just being like, oh yeah, like we need to just like, I don't know, because I actually talked with I remember talking with someone at the Nation of Islam for a documentary screening with a younger guy, and he was like, yeah, like what we need is like to not have the separation of church and state anymore. But I don't know if I don't think that's really the solution. But it's like actually like I think it's like, yeah, there are things to draw from the modern and from the liberal, some at least certain like, yeah, this even the basic conception of rights, I feel like is still very important. It's like, why do the Palestinian people have a right to resist occupation? Like I think this has been like very important in terms of like how we understand the world, but it's like obviously, I agree that there are things to draw from also what we call the pre-modern, which are not fully captured in the kind of modern liberal secular state.
Right. Well, I mean, I wanted to. I think the reason I was thinking it was not a negation. It's because I think like the answer that liberalism gave to the problems of the medieval Europe, let's say, it was not a universal answer, I think, because it did not come. I mean, this was not the only answer that world humanity came up with to answer similar problems, like to answer similar questions. And I mean, we don't have to go back to this whole, but it's one of those debates, right, about whether or not the like feudalism to through the French Revolution to communism and so on, whether or not this is the only arc of revolutionary like progress. It's not a, but I mean, not even to that. But I think to what you were saying, I think the thing that is universal, however, in terms of modernity, is the relationship between the people and the leadership, and this is I think this is modern because I think like it's universal and modern because like all the liberation movements all over the world. I mean, yes, I'm trying to like yeah, they were like liberal in the sense that they did not go beyond the assumptions of the people, that like the liberal assumption of what the people is, but it was an effort in the same direction, that the distance between the people and the leadership of freedom movements was ultimately, it was a rejection of the complete separation of the people with the ruling class. And this is what I mean in terms of modernity. I think this is also one of the, like, it's a universal modern feature where like this election again is a statement to that it's a rejection of the alienation of the people by the ruling class. And I mean this goes to like that like the long Atlantic essay where he's also talking about, yes, like like the university, what it has produced is an elite who are completely in a bubble, completely alienated from the people, and of course the people will like reject them. But this is a, yeah, I think it's a question for modernity, because this is the direction in which people and the leadership has moved. And I think even like this is also something we always talk about, that maybe even 60, 70, or at least during the Russian Revolution, the idea or the ideological struggle for the democratic remaking was still a question to be resolved by the revolutionary vanguard. And I don't know if we can say the same thing about today, because this is a question that the people are, or that's what we have been like thinking about, like saying for a while, that it's like this is the time where the people enter the stages of history. That's what Baldwin is reminding us, that like that quote about when the masses of people enter history. But yeah, I think that's why it's a modern yeah, that's why this is a question of modernity. And I think liberalism, I mean, I'm not like refuting the progress that liberalism did signify, but I'm not, yeah, I guess I'm not fully sure if it was okay, if it was as much of a negation of the the church state as, for instance, say the anti-colonial philosophy, or the black, or the black liberation, or the black radical tradition Du Bois was to to the idea of liberal freedom and so on.
I just thought, like, I guess how I would see it is, like, I do think that liberalism was like an actual negation. And like, I feel like, I do think that liberalism was, in its time, like hundreds of years ago, an actual negation of like the feudal church state. And it's like, I feel like part of, I guess how I would like interpret it is that, yeah, like the world anti-colonial struggle, the Black freedom movement was an attempt to then answer, yeah, what was left unanswered by liberals. And I feel like, and so I feel like in that sense I agree, but I don't feel like you need to, or at least in my opinion, I don't feel like we need to be like, oh, like it wasn't a negation of the feudal church system, when it's also, yeah, like this is happening like hundreds of years before, like and that the world anti-colonial struggle, the Black freedom movement, that is the actual movement of the stages of history of like actually, okay, like revolutionary movements birth new contradictions that it's like, it's not like a one cut and dry.
Right. Can I ask one more thing too? So, like, would you say that like the liberal and the French Revolution, ultimately it was the defense of the the establishment of a class, of the bourgeois class that was already in existence. So it's to say that the movement is going to be from the rule of the feudal class to the rule of the bourgeois class.
I think the thing is that I think from what Doc was saying, like liberalism itself, yes, was the rise of a new class, but that class itself actually was revolutionary, like for its time, like in its time. And I think for me, my feeling is actually like from your overall like beginning presentation, negation, like the process of negation does not require completion. Like there's no requirement for a level of completion. And I think rejection for me, what it implies is almost like not participating in the dialectical movement of history, but just kind of sidestepping it. Whereas I think negation is like the attempt, and no matter how incomplete it is. And I feel like it actually addresses a lot of like the general anxiety here that I've been feeling, where I'm like, right now is a really like complex, difficult time.
Yes.
And the Trump movement is not like an easy good. Like it has a lot of issues. There are a lot of issues everywhere. And I feel like what I feel is that I don't feel confident that I can do like a full negation, or that like, we will like reach completion in like the next 5 years. But I feel like there is something that we can do to help like progress it a tiny bit. And I guess it's also that from this moment in history, I feel it's nice, I think, to feel almost a sense of like kinship or a sense of like resonance in all of these like past struggles. And that like, I would hope that, I guess, in the future, people wouldn't look at us and be like, oh, but they didn't like go all the way, like they couldn't do all of it. Well, I don't know, because I feel like it's that I do agree that I think the world anti-colonial struggles got us much closer to where we are now. And that's like the closest or most resonant for right now, also with the civil rights movement. But I think it's also like, for instance, it's not like we would say like the civil rights movement was inherently like a better revolution than the first American Revolution, like for its time. Like I feel like it's the civil rights movement also in some ways like took on or adopted and then absorbed and like took further what was started in the American Revolution. And so I feel like
But yeah, going off with nursing, I think it's connected to, the more I thought about it, I actually kind of agree with what Jeremiah is saying in terms of that one way of seeing the civil rights movement is actually the civil rights movement took liberal democracy to its exhaustion and began the foundation of a new, because
I'm sorry.
I know this might take time, I'm sorry, but I actually wanted to read something that Grace Lee Boggs wrote from a few years before she passed away in 2015, where she kind of talks about this philosophically. Because in some ways, her argument is that what the civil rights movement did, plus Jeremiah's point about that the civil rights movement took liberal democracy to its as far as it could go, and then began the work of a new philosophy on which a new state could be born, and revolutionary emancipatory democracy could actually be fulfilled, like a new ideology, new philosophy. She talks about Bush, which is funny because you kind of don't associate Grace Lee Boggs. You associate her with like the 60s, 70s, but she like lived until Obama even, who she criticized in this book. But she says, the end of the Bush regime provides an opening to build national and international recognition of the movement to grow our souls, which began emerging organically in the United States in the aftermath of World War II. The dropping of the atom bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki demonstrated the enormous power and the enormous limitations of viewing human beings primarily as producers and as rational beings in the scientific sense. At the time, Einstein remarked, quote, "The unleashed power of the atom bomb has changed everything except our modes of thinking, and thus we drift toward unparalleled catastrophes," end quote. Thus, he recognized the urgent need for us to redefine what it means to be a human being. Warning about the danger of unfettered technological progress, Einstein asserted that the solution of world peace could arise only from inside the hearts of humankind. That is why, quote, "imagination is more important than knowledge." I don't know what he means by that. Quote, "A human being," Einstein concluded, "is a part of the whole, called by us universe, a part limited in time and space. He experiences himself, his thoughts and feelings as something separated from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of his consciousness. This delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for a few persons nearest to us. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature and its beauty." Okay, this is the part that I really want to get to. Grace Lee Boggs says, "The nuclear bomb created a great divide in theories and strategies for social change. Henceforth, human beings could no longer pretend that everything that happened to us was determined by external or economic circumstances. Freedom now included the responsibility for making choices. Radical social change can no longer be viewed in terms of transferring power from the top to the bottom, or of simple binary oppositions, us versus them, victims versus villains, good versus evil. We could no longer afford a separation between politics and ethics. Within the Marxist-Leninist paradigm, consciousness and self-consciousness and ideas and values were mere superstructure. Now they had to become integral, both as end and as means, to social struggle. Radical social change had to be viewed as a two-sided transformational process of ourselves and of our institutions, a process requiring protracted struggle and not just a D-Day replacement of one set of rulers with another. Okay, this is the last paragraph and the key, I think. The Montgomery bus boycott of 1955 to 56 was the first struggle by an oppressed people in Western society from this new philosophical political perspective. Before the eyes of the whole world, a people who had been treated as less than human struggled against their dehumanization, not as angry victims or rebels, but as new men and women, representative of a new, more human society. Practicing methods of nonviolence that transform themselves and increase the good rather than the evil in the world. And always bearing in mind that their goal was not only desegregating the buses, but creating the beloved community. They inspired the human identity and ecological movements that over the past 40 years have been creating a new civil society in the United States. But the reason why I like that is the way she emphasizes, the way she says, they weren't simply desegregating buses, it was the production of new men and women who were creating a new civil society. Because in some ways, the question is, like, I forget how Dawson laid it out with liberalism, but liberalism, essentially, the end result is the creation of a civil society, is a specific kind of civil society based upon certain assumptions of a social contract.
If I could just,
Yeah.
a society based on every individual pursuing his or her rational interests.
Interesting. Yes.
Interest trumps love, trumps
Right.
human solidarity. And that's what King was always
Yes.
addressing.
And I think people do not take King seriously enough when he says a radical revolution of values. What he's defining is a new kind of revolution. Because it impacted me when you said the Chinese Revolution was a bourgeois revolution done by communists, which is also why the Communist Party of China, that's why Xi Jinping is always saying, by 2050, we will have achieved socialism. Because they acknowledge that China is still in the long pursuit.
Yes.
We have achieved the bourgeois revolution, but as communists, we have yet to achieve socialism. Like, we are in a long struggle to achieve
This
socialism.
is so interesting. Can I just a small thing? We have achieved state power and will use it to complete the bourgeois democratic revolution and to build socialism. And I agree. If I could just say, I agree 300% with Grace Lee Boggs that the objective of humanity is not a new economic system, but a new civilization, a new moral system.
Can I just also, I think this relates to what Kathy was also asking, whether the civilization state in itself is like an answer to some of the contradictions of liberalism or whatever. But I think what we're discussing now and what you read out, I think that offers the most viable answer we have to the contradictions of American society, which was founded on the basis of liberalism, where this relates to what we've also said in Nandita's essay, is that Black people were the first modern colored people, or they were able to achieve a civilizational basis that came from a worldview, an imaginary and a revolutionary chronology that rejected even like white supremacy or whiteness. And on the basis of that philosophical like grounding, that framework, they were able to basically put on the table something viable that could be incorporated. And I don't know whether you would call it a renewal of liberalism or would you call it something completely else. I tend to fall on the side of something completely new. But even more than like civilizational states in the Chinese, or I don't know whether India falls, I guess it falls into that category. It was that social struggle. It was that philosophy or the method applied to what will happen to society, what will happen to human beings inside society and their relations with each other, but also the state, that actually created a basis for both the modernity and civilization. No, but everything you read just reminded me of that. I mean, it sort of puts into context the different pieces that we have been talking about, but they come together under the same banner, I think.
I would underscore that with the historic impact of Philadelphia being part of that Montgomery boycott. The actual strategy came out of North Philadelphia. I think Tony will collaborate or corroborate that Dr. Sullivan had brought from New York and Abyssinian Baptist Church the impact of economic struggle. And Dr. King had studied in this area and was familiar with how the people of Philadelphia began to withhold their revenues from the corporations in order to get their attention and demonstrate that if we impact your revenues or your revenue stream, you will have to listen. So there's a symbiosis of changing the feudal system, if you will, because the people even in the feudal system, the peons actually run the whole thing. They give consent to the leader. Leader has nothing without the peonage. So, in moving past forward, the people themselves have become a force to be reckoned with and respected. So that started, historically started here. Most people think it started in Montgomery, but actually it started here, and we witnessed it because we were children and we were being told that we were going to make a difference. And I guess I'm blessed to have lived long enough to see the difference and see us. I'm questioning whether we're back in that struggle again, but I will acknowledge that we have the potential to change.
I want to be very brief because I know where to. Well, I was thinking about Douthat's article where he kind of and this also goes back to Purba's point about authority, where you can't really trace back who has the authority. It's like this pervasive system which sort of puts out an idea and then it catches hold, but if it leads to something, you can't really trace it back to where it originated. And I look at the people who I work with, and they have these ideas which are sort of broadly sort of propagated through this institutional machinery. And then there is, at the end of the day, there's no accountability. And this is also what Douthat actually says, that the kind of system that we are currently living under, individuals do not have to worry about accountability. And it's a sort of self-insulating system where they're like, okay, you can say whatever you want, but you, on the first hand, will probably not even know if the words that you're saying is going to affect somebody somewhere else. And if it even does, it won't ever come back to you. And these are the same people, the people that I work with and at Penn, who have this notion that, well, let's talk about the 2024 elections. This should not have happened. And if you ask them, as I did, that why do you think this should not have happened? This is the will of the people, right? Like most people in a democratic society has voted for this man. And they say no. Their entire argument is that no, I am the smart one. The majority is stupid, and
That's the argument.
and this is what made me think about because I was also thinking about last week's conversation and about liberalism, but then it also made me think about democracy. Like the concept of democracy, how does it fit into liberalism? Because currently liberal democracy is just a word in my head. It does not make sense. because in last night's limited reading of whatever I did to prepare for today, if I remember, like John Locke's idea was that the consent of the governed was secured through a majority rule. But however, England and other like in England in that time and other democratic societies did not have all people part of the electorate. There was a large faction of society that was not part of the electorate, and so not every person had an equal say in what was being done as part of that majority rule. And so I couldn't really find any, like when I was reading this, I might be wrong, I couldn't find any connection between liberalism and any form of democratic government. And so when the concept of liberal democracy comes, I don't understand it anymore. Because you're trying to put together the organization of a democratic government with the ideological, philosophical underpinnings of liberalism.
Absolutely.
And that makes me question a lot of things, like have we kind of ever lived in a liberal democracy? Right? If we are living in a democracy, and this is something I found out recently, that a populist move, I didn't know what a populist movement was. It's not just a popular movement, it's also something that has been historically related to anti-establishment, anti-government kind of movement. So if we are living in a kind of liberal democracy, which is supposed to have the ideology of liberalism and the functioning of the democracy, why should a populist movement exist in the first place?
Absolutely.
But it does, right? And so so one of the questions that was raised is that is the real threat to liberalism populism? But I don't know. This makes me feel like liberalism is its own worst enemy in the way that it has matured. And this was also something. This is. I came to this because I was thinking about modernity, and I was thinking that if the idea of freedom. This is something that I wrote down after coming in this morning. If the idea of freedom was at the core of the expectations of progress that modernity is associated with, and we can say that, at least I believe, that freedom is a universal quality, can we even say that modernity has been achieved by Europeans if modernity is based on freedom, and freedom was not the agenda for most people of the world when the white population was supposedly entering modernity? And this, I'm very confused is what I'm trying to say, because when I read King and Baldwin and Du Bois, I feel like they have a completely different understanding or completely different layout of what it means for a population to enter modernity. And I do believe that whiteness and liberalism can't now more or less I have to think about it dialectically, in that it can't be separated, and it coexists, it contradicts, but it's still there together. And the crisis of liberalism and modernity seems to be the crisis of whiteness at the end of the day. And the last thing I'll say is that, you sent me that David Brooks article in the New York Times, and I think I told I had this thought where David Brooks is kind of saying that we have to move away from thinking about history as the history of liberation struggles, which is what has led us here. And I don't really agree with that at all, because I think because in spite of all of his like thought and and everything that he's writing about questioning, which I agree with, like you have to question, but I think he gets the civil rights movement so wrong. He gets the civil rights movement so wrong that he's looking for answers in places that he probably can't find.
Can't find that answer, yeah.
I feel like the point of reading someone like David Brooks is not even to like agree or disagree with them, but it's like what I feel like a lot of people like David Brooks and like even like Ross Dafa, like what they're supposed to be doing is almost like we have to show that like, essentially like the people don't trust the media anymore. So we have to actually show that we understand the people and like we're trying to grapple with our own problems and therefore you should trust us again. I feel like a lot of it is an exercise in like trying to show that like actually, yeah, like we're trying to like actually we can diagnose the problem and therefore you should trust us because
But I don't see it as virtue signaling at all.
I think it's honest.
I do. I think, especially David Brooks and Ross do that.
Hello?
Matter of fact, I think, by the way, I think they're very serious intellectuals, both of them. Really, I mean, as good as you're going to get, And I think, I like opinion pieces because they're not long like the rest of the articles in the New York Times. But I think, I do think they're serious people who can help us understand the crisis of liberalism.
Right.
That's what I
But it's not the crisis of whiteness, I think.
No, well, definitely not that, because that would hit too close to home.
And now I feel like they can't be separated. So
But
now
I agree with that.
So now I sort of
Yes.
take them with a pinch of salt. That's all.
Yes.
No, I would agree that, Ross, all these people, that's why last week I'd also said that I thought Fukuyama's article was less satisfying to me
Yes,
than
no,
Doubt because there's some honest searching in what these people are doing. One last thing, is this question about whether modernity was really achieved. Another question I have is how do you bring in the postmodern to all of into all of this? And I think the point of the postmodern was to basically say you're saying should be questioned is that modernity was achieved with liberal thought becoming like the epitome in some ways of human development, human growth, and so on and so forth. And so since modernity had been achieved, you needed post-modernity to basically like sort of explain the individual in their evolution, with the changing times and so on and so forth. But it is a valid question. And I think it goes to the heart of why so much of postmodernism is obscure and abstract and so on, is because it starts from a fundamentally flawed perception of modernity or something. But this is a longer conversation that we should probably have.
Okay, we're gonna read comments and then we're gonna end.
Okay.
Which I think Doc will be sad about because he likes the comments.
Well, excuse me.
Lay down the hammer.
There aren't too many comments, so I think we'll be done by the time. Oh, no. Okay. Todd said good morning. Mark said good morning. Matt said the liberal world order is completely exposed and in crisis. And then MBR said hi. I think they're saying that the ruling class is closer to neoliberals than classical liberals, and that the aristocrats were surprised even up to the day of storming the Bastille. It's similar conditions here. Matt says non-Western spiritual insight seems relevant almost taboo in discussions about building a socially just society. If one is intelligent, they should be free from the subjectivity of whiteness and any subjectivity, you know? MBR says those gifted with intellect have the obligation or the responsibility to carry forward social progress. Celeste Radcliffe is just throwing out, I think, terms of classism, classless society, question of socialism, what is internal, what is revenue, and then heart emoji. MBR says the Chinese actually do struggle with contextualizing the utility of liberalism, yet they are light years ahead. And then Matt said, Tulsi Gabbard and Matt Gates may be difficult to characterize, but it seems some people might be exhibiting undue confidence that they actually represent a challenge to the system. Similarly, it seems pretty dubious to be confident about Trump representing a challenge to the state. But I feel like that's what's to come, which is that we'll see like how far Trump actually can go.
That's what you were raising, you know.
And then MBR says burger revolutions are a little bit different. They usually entail military officers and coups. And then No Thing asks, how do you set up a screening of the documentary?
Oh, nice. Oh, yes. Well, drop your email, nothing111. Should we announce our reading?
Oh, it's on video, sorry.
It's on YouTube too. On YouTube. Should we announce our reading group this week?
Sure.
Speaking of the documentary screening, we're happy to announce that we're starting a new reading group, even at the stage of the Year of Baldwin at the Lucian Blackwell Regional Library, which is a branch of the free library system in West Philadelphia on 52nd Street. This will start on November 19th and be Tuesdays at 4:30 p.m. We've been working with also a really, really great group of librarians, in particular, Barbara, who we would like to shout out. And one of the things we're looking forward to also doing to kick off the reading group is also that the day before the first day of the reading group, we're going to be screening the documentary on the Monday, November 18 at 4:30. 2 days from now, very soon. So we hope to see everyone there. And yeah, we're really excited that there will be, for, I guess, context, we were no longer able to meet at the Making World Reading Group due to some logistical challenges they had in keeping hours open on Sundays. But we just really felt that it was not right that West Philly would not have a reading group. So it really mattered to us to find the right home. And we're really happy to have the Lucian Blackwell Library. That's it. Okay, that was a great conversation. No Thing says, thank you. My group would like someone from the free school to speak during the screening. Okay, No Thing, drop your email. If you drop your email, then we can, or just email us at freeschoolmedia@gmail.com. So, we'll put it there. But otherwise, good discussion, and we're gonna end the live stream.